welcome to an especially animated version of the Crash Chords podcast. Well, I guess it's audio, so we can be animated by being excited.
I see what you did. It was a pun.
No, it was a Steve level pun. But I'll give you, it's at least a Steve level pun. I mean, that's a fairly low
To us,
tier.
that's a compliment.
I'm brimming with pride. I don't know about you.
I'm, of course, Matt.
I'm John.
I'm Steve.
And we have a very special guest this month, good friends of mine, Ed and Chuck. Say hello.
Hey, what's up, y'all?
How's it going, man?
Which one is Ed?
I'm Ed. Sorry.
Yes, and I'm Chuck.
Both who have popular comic strips that I'm a big fan of. Chuck, who does Bounce, and Ed, who does Fermented Zen. They've, of course, done many other things, but those are the current projects that I am particularly proud of. Also, because in Fermented Zen, I've been in it a few times, which is always fun.
Yes,
Twice so far.
Yes.
And both comics have actually done a crossover with each other.
Yep.
You became friends in Bounce, and then went to the way station Fermented Zen, or the station, as it's called.
Right.
Just in case, I get in trouble with Anders and he doesn't want me to be there anymore. I can still do the strip without any being sued by him.
Because it's technically the station, even though he's been featured in it as well several times.
And he's been featured in it under his own name. I noticed that you've changed a lot of names overall in that comic.
Not really.
No, most
Professor
of
What's It?
Oh,
that's Doctor Who.
That's just a running gag, right?
Yeah.
And a time toilet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that one.
That's the best.
It's
gag
not
of all.
toilet. It's there's a period in between each of the letters.
Well, let's get some years down here. Fermented Zen is not that old of a project, correct?
No, it's on and off. I started it 2 years ago. Then I stopped for a while because I was doing it hand drawn on paper and scanning it in and doing all that kind of stuff. Then I stopped it for a while. Then I restarted again about a year ago, maybe. But now it's all digitally done. It's all done in a Manga Studio, so it's much quicker and easier.
Very high quality.
But thanks.
And I have to say, I don't notice a difference between the two styles. It seems like your hand drawn did really translate well back to the computer.
Well, I do it on a Cintiq, so I'm still technically drawing it.
Gotcha.
It's just I'm not doing a pencil, then inking it by hand, and then scanning it in the computer, and then trying to tweak it and fix it, and make it look nice.
You're doing it the modern way.
Yeah.
Very, very classy. So, since this is not going chronological, we're going back in time. This is a very Whovian podcast. We're going back through your careers. So, in that case, you were working on Bounce together. How old is Bounce as a project?
Bounce is just him. They've
Bounce.
done
I thought you said
crossovers.
that earlier.
They've had crossovers.
Crossovers.
Characters from both
Borrows
strips have
Gotcha.
crossed over.
I started Bounce in 2014. Actually, last Saturday was a year since I put out the first one.
Gotcha.
And you had a special episode type of a piece. You had a reoccurring characters from one of your very, very early strips.
I had Triborough Tales was a comic that me and another creator, actually my business partner Keith Miller, wrote, and we came out with that a long time ago and decided to just go crazy with this storyline of 4 friends that lived in New York, and then just dealing with relationship stuff and living in the city and everything. So we did the first volume, and then we started working on other projects. I myself had freelance stuff to do. He had his own projects, and then I started doing Bounce. So it was the first time I was doing something by myself. I've done other things, but this was the thing that it was my baby. So Keith came along and said, "I want to do one." And I was like, all right, cool. This is my boy of 20 years.
Okay.
And I know how he can get. And I know his style of writing, which is good. But I was like, what are you going to do? And he kind of took it somewhere, and I looked at it. He sent me the script. And I was like, dude, why? Why'd you do this? And he was just like, trust me. Just if you don't like it, I'll change it. I was like, no. We're going to leave it. We're going to leave it alone. And it actually became one of the funniest ones. It was it was the prettiest, raunchiest I've done in the whole series. So that came out pretty good. And then we did another one. I think we did 2 more after that. We had a crossover.
Well, correct me if this is off the mark here, but I get sort of a Doonesbury vibe from Bounce. I see sort of political edges. Obviously, living in the city, you get to kind of throw in those overtones. Am I off the mark, or is this
I was a big fan of Doonesbury. When I was a kid, I read Doonesbury, and when I couldn't really understand some of the political stuff that was going on, especially at the time.
No kid could.
Whatever. I mean, nobody. It was
everyone wondered, why does this belong in the funny pages?
But the thing is, for me, I was like, yo, everything is so intense. Yo, shit's going down right now. Everybody was talking about something I didn't know about. I had to have probably read like a whole year's worth beforehand to know what was going on. But I think what Bounce is that since it takes place in the bar, these are the kind of conversations you hear every day. Like, especially from all different walks of life. I mean, we got college kids, we have people from the business world, we have meathead sports dudes that come in, we have everybody who gets drunk and their real aspects come out. And you get to hear those conversations. Even if you don't want to, you have no choice. So they kind of just get ingrained in the head.
So you set up a setting, essentially, where it's the perfect lens through which to tackle all of these issues on kind of like fair ground.
Right.
Nice approach.
Well, one of your comics that actually really stuck out was the scene where you have a couples going by, and it's the same couple, scene after panel after panel, and you go through the three of them. And when you hit the third panel, you're talking about how being a conformist and being unique, and you delve into this whole big thing about how society is sort of making everybody the same because shunning the outsider is a good thing. And then you sum it all up with maybe there's just a cloning factory for all these douchebags. Yeah. I like that combination of you got a little bit of philosophy really filtering in, and it's a nice dry humor.
Right.
But then you still got the punchline going on that final panel, which is a great way to sum up a lot of these ridiculous things that you go through.
And also you get to explore the caricatures of the people making the claims, which is the best part, and that's why comics are the avenue.
Well, that whole joke came about one night. And exactly how that went down is pretty much, I wouldn't say verbatim, but I was standing outside one of the guys I was working with, and then we just started noticing everyone was looking the same. But it was weird because it was like Stepford Wives, but it was just people. It was like dudes and chicks, and like you had all the guys would come out, and they all like different races. But they all had the same kind of cut, same button-down shirt, the same khakis, the same everything. And then after a while, I called it like douchebag gear, and like because you like little counterparts and like the little shirt, maybe there's like a little thing of cocaine here, and like another part you put your flask and be like whatever. But I started seeing this, and I was like, this is an ongoing trend. I don't know where this and it just became a thing. I said, there's got to be a cloning facility somewhere where they just make these dudes, put them out in yellow taxis, and just spread them out across the city to just get on our nerves. But
hipsters don't see color, but they have a whole different realm of problems.
Oh, yeah. See, actually, that's for another one. I was going to do one with the hipster cloning facility, but I didn't get to that one yet.
Okay. Preview.
Gotcha.
Is it all natural? Is it like
oh, yeah.
It's organic.
It's organic.
Exactly.
They're all made out of soy.
Going back to Ed, I just have one question about the strip. The events that you showcase in Fermented Zen, do they happen, or are you just extrapolating?
Not when I'm singing and I make my own little drunk world. No.
Which is probably my favorite.
You're singing to your drinks is a lot of fun.
My serenade drinking, yes. That's a sign of a true alcoholic. No.
Well, my favorite thing about that comic, though, is that's one of that comic features a Lionel Richie song, right? The lyrics that you're singing. Hello. And I'm one of the patrons giving him shit at the end, like, oh, he's had too much. Like, put the music guy in the music strip, which was fun. But yeah, literally singing to his drink.
Right. No, I mean, it's just, they're close. I mean, if you've been to the way station,
yeah.
And it's so much like, I mean, not actually, but like a lot of conversations are like kind of like. I'm just confused half the time when it comes to the thing. I mean, I love them, and this is going to get me in so much trouble, right? But I hate them. No, not hate them. I love my friends at the way station, but like, there's like this sort of nerd hierarchy that goes on, and it just baffles me that because and I'm me too. I'm including myself. Don't get me wrong. I mean, we're all we're in a nerd bar.
Yeah, everyone's got to be king of their own universe.
Yeah. And it's just like it's just kind of me, kind of like trying to figure out what's going on, I guess. Actually, it was in the first one when I was doing it by hands. The first strip I actually put up on Tumblr. Somebody wrote back, it's like, screw you and you're, the cool guy hanging out making fun of nerds at the bar, at the way station. We don't need another, Big Bang Theory kind of strip making fun of nerds. And I'm like, well, that's not what I intended at all.
I'm one of them.
It's like, it's just the first page. It's like, how can you even like, and I thought it was great that I got some kind of response right out of the gate. But no, I mean, they're all, I would say, anybody who's like, that's about 80% of the people that I draw in the strip are actually based on somebody, and that's probably like their actions or what they would actually say.
I think the internet is like the first I think institution ever where people are more likely to actually find that something was intended to be celebratory is actually intended to be an insult. It's not really, but they're going to infer that because in the internet, no, you're supposed to read into things. Sometimes you're not.
Oh no,
Sometimes.
that's the big difference between like his is more Doonesbury, mine's more Al Cap.
That's
It's a slice of
handicap.
life.
Handicap, yeah.
And it's, I kind of when I started off, I wanted to be like not so much like it's not deep, and it's never gonna get freaking deep, right?
Well, actually, that's interesting. I touched upon that because I was sort of trying to distinguish the different styles here, and it seems like yours is a little more like the one individual goes in and it's sort of like through just his lens, as opposed to more of a societal lens, which seems like what you're tackling.
Right.
But in your case, it seems more just like this one person caught up in the midst and just trying to make sense of it all. And very rarely, by the end of the cartoon, does it actually make sense. You're left with more questions than answers, it seems.
The one comic, why is it so busy here on Sunday night?
Oh,
Wait,
no,
Sunday night,
Nerdy
Yogi.
which is
And
real.
there's
Yes.
the Star Wars lyrics that are going on in the background. which I
carry
thought
on my Padawan. Yeah,
I love that because I heard it going right through there.
and that's all right. To talk about how accurate things are, I mean, I came up with that joke with Joe, who was the guy, and Joe, who runs Nerdy Yogi. I told him he actually wrote and he changed the lyrics to the entire song and sung it at Nerdy Yogi. Just because I thought that was hilarious, and I'm like, I just need a couple of lines, and so he's the guy who's singing it is actually Joe.
We've had Joe.
Yeah, we've had Joe as a guest.
So yeah,
Couple
so it's
times.
like it to say, is it accurate or is it something? Not really, but you kind of wish it did.
Yeah.
Kinda like, but people like, but the way I wanted to view it, almost like, is like if you go to the bar, you might see this happening.
If you
as
go
the
to the
viewer.
bar, you'll know what Nerdioki is.
Right.
If you don't go to the bar,
But I kind of set it up.
Yeah,
I mean,
you
like,
set it up pretty well.
It's like it's almost like if you go to the bar, you might see this happening in real life. But in a strip, you're like virtually walking into the bar, you might see this happening.
Yeah.
Well, if I were to reduce it, and of course it's very, very hard to reduce an entire compendium of any comic strip, but if I were to reduce it, it seems like your comic strip is more like, well, let's make an aggregated point based on what we see, and it seems like yours is, let's make an aggregated... I give up.
I guess when it comes to what I do, it's more from the perspective of the guy who works at the door. No one really pays attention to that guy. If anything, no one really wants to deal with that guy because it's like, I just want to get inside and drink, and you're in my way.
Yeah.
And I get on everyone's nerves, but they don't realize that I am but when they get drunk, they want to come talk to me.
Then all of a sudden you're a journalist too.
Yeah. And I think the interesting thing is about the character and what I've dealt with that inspired a lot of stories was that I would have to size up people as soon as they come to the door. I am the person that greets. I set the tone. So you come to the door, you see the bar for what it is. You can probably see it from the outside, look inside. Maybe the ambiance is kind of nice and everything, but I'm the person that you have to deal with before the bartender, before the manager, before anybody else. I'm the dude. So some bouncers can get a little bit like, I'm an asshole, or give me your ID or whatever. But other people like myself were just like, look, we want the bar to make money. We welcome you in. Just don't break the rules. And with that, we have to size everybody up. Everyone's coming from a different walk of life, and you don't know necessarily what you're going to get. You can get the dude that's having a good day, and he'll come in and he'll be like, yeah, here's my ID, man. How your day going? I'm like, yeah, I'm good, man. All right, brother, I'll see you later. And they go inside and they do their thing.
3 hours later.
Oh, God. But then, see, I have a thing that I came up with, which is pretty funny. Like, you could tell a lot by the way someone gives you their ID. All right, I have a thing.
This is
I asked them for ideas. Let me ask you your ID, please. They hand it to me. I look at it, and I look at them in the eye, and I say, here, thank you very much. Depending on how they take it is exactly what they're going to be like for the rest of the night. The first dude will probably take it and look at me and like, thanks, man, have a good night, and they go inside. Usually 9 times out of 10, no problem. The other dude looks at me and does this, snatches it, and runs inside. That's usually the dude who's not going to tip, who's very self-entitled, you're going to tell him, dude, you can't sit there in the middle of the aisle where everyone is trying to walk. Why you got to tell me this, man? I'm trying to just have some fun. No, dude, you can't know. He's the self-entitled dude. Or you have the timid one who just looks at you. He won't even look at you. He'll just be like, all right, go. You could just tell a lot by body language. And for me, when I start to see most of these people get drunk, or their true aspects come out, depending on on how they are, you will see they probably had a bad day at work. They had a great day at work. probably dealing with something really bad at home. They're probably dealing with something good at home. They probably just met their first girlfriend. I've seen couples meet and fall in love. I've seen couples break up. I've seen people get bad news, good news, all kinds of stuff. But you never know what you're going to get. But you have to deal with it. I can't move. And I have to be sober the whole time. So.
Well, that's why, I mean, I certainly was being serious before, actually, when I said, like, you have to be a journalist in some respects. And even beyond that, you know, journalists very often come to the bouncers. Like, they're very often the contacts for any journalist. If you need to catch a story from beginning to end, go to the bouncer.
It's
because
true.
they caught it from the beginning. They caught it from the end. They didn't just capture the snippet of the story. They got the book from its cover and then also the unholy aftermath.
I mean, I used to work the door at the way station for like once a week for a while. And that's why it's like when he tells these stories, I think they're freaking hilarious. I mean, because it's like, what was it? The clencher. The guy with the ID. When tell him about the clencher.
The clencher is this guy. You ask him for his ID, and he goes up, he pulls it out, and he holds it. Like, this is you. This is like, you're showing me the ID.
They're pantomiming how you hold the ID.
So I'm just like...
And I grab it, I'm like, okay, let me...
It
won't rip.
Like he won't let it go.
It's like he won't let it go. And it's like he's just looking at me like, no, I will not give it to you. I'm like, dude, there is no way that I had woke up early in the morning with you, the image of your face in my head, and say, I'm going to steal his ID, and therefore my life is fulfilled. It's not going to happen that way. Okay? I just want to see it so you could go in and drink and I'll never have to look at you again.
Yeah, that's right.
But for some weird reason, people feel like I'm going to steal it from them. And that's one of the things that I just don't get that.
Yeah.
You know, and then there's the other guy, the close-up dude. He'll take the ID and he'll, like, put it in my, right here.
Right,
and I'm
right in his face,
dude, why? If I opened a book and told you to read from paragraph to paragraph, you wouldn't be able to do it. So why do you think I'm going to be able to do it?
In this world of identity theft rampant, how can you tell? You need to be proven. All right, let's ask this. In that case, what percentage would you say of your inspiration comes from your bouncing activities?
I would say maybe about 60% of the stuff that I go through. A lot of it...
Was there an initial spark in the course of your being a cartoonist?
Well, when it comes to the art, I mean, I've been drawing
predates,
I've been drawing for ever since I could remember. When it comes to the actual webcomic, I guess it was like one of those things where people... I would tell people stories of things that happened at the bar. And I couldn't make this shit up, so people would, like, sit there and crack up all day. And I was like, oh, man, you should totally do a comic book. But I was like, nah, whatever. I don't think anybody will get it. I think only people that work in the bar industry will get it. I didn't think anybody was going to, like, see something from the point of view of a bouncer. But I think the one event that sparked this whole thing, and it's weird. We have this local guy, he's a junkie. I'm not going to name his name right now, but he's the local guy. He's the local junkie.
The local Brooklyn junkie.
Yeah. So he was high on his
junk.
Exactly. His junk.
That's the name.
So I'm standing in front of the door. Me and my friend Stevie, who works with me, and we're standing in front of the door. And he walks up, and he's on a junk, and he's like just standing there with his eyes closed, his mouth open, and these girls come in. And this is during the summer, so these girls, they come in and they're like cleavage out and everything, they're looking all sexy, whatever. They come in, I check their IDs, and he looks at them, he opens his eyes for 2 seconds and goes, oh yeah! And I'm just so like, all right, fine, this is what's going on right now. So they come in, but I guess they weren't satisfied with the bar or whatever, so literally in 5 minutes they just walk out. And my buddy Stevie's like, oh, ladies leaving so early. I mean, what's going on? It's like, oh, we're going somewhere else. And so they took some time to get out. And as they were coming out, junkie dude opens his eyes for 2 seconds. He goes, hey, you got hair on your titties. And I'm like, what?
And this began your career.
Well, this is
what I'm gathering so far.
So, but the thing that was funny was he goes, it's what he said right after they left that really got me.
Yeah.
They go, and they're, like, freaked out now. They're, like, running up the block. This dude comes out of his his craziness, and he looks at me, and he goes, I don't care if you a man or a woman, everybody got hair on their titties. It could be 1, it could be 20, but you got hair on your titties. I cracked up so bad that I said, I can't. This has to happen now. I went to the back, because, usually me and the door guy, we switch up. Like, I'll spend 2 hours in the front checking IDs, and the other bouncers in the back, and we switch it up every 2 hours. And I run to the back. I swear to God, I went through probably about 150 ideas for the comic.
It's true.
Just went through it. I sent it to him.
He showed me. He was like, look. And he's scrolling up. He's like, and it was like the day or like a week before. You're like, I think I might, or like a week after that happened.
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm gonna do a comic about bouncing. And he's like, I got 150. I'm like,
I went through everything. I went through kicking out the drunk girl, cocaine heads at the bar, dancing on the tables, fake IDs. Like, I went through the whole roster of the stuff that we dealt with, and I just went to town. And I was great. I said I'll do the first couple as a joke to see what happens, and then afterwards it just became, people started liking it. I didn't think anybody was going to get it. I thought people only in the industry was going to like kind of understood, but I was like, oh, well,
No,
so it was the spark not only for you to like realize this can be like a continuous avenue of material, but also that something simultaneously people latched on.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So now that we've got the collaborative inspirations here, or rather the separate inspirations, I want to talk a little bit about what you do together, seeing as you are here together, not just because you're comic book artists, or comic artists rather, but also because you have worked together. You are collaborators and also friends. So take us back in time a little bit.
Well, we used to belong to this. We actually knew each other before we actually physically knew each other. Mm-hmm. We only knew each other for what, two years now? Physically?
Physically for
face
about,
to face?
Yeah, for about 2 years, yeah.
But there was about 10 years ago?
This was in, I remember,
was it
drawing board was
2004, maybe? But no,
yeah,
that we started,
no,
was it gaining popularity?
It was gaining popularity. I think it was around 2000.
There was this message board. Is it message board? Is that what they call it now?
Mm-hmm.
That's still a constant.
Okay, all right, sorry. Called The Drawing Board. It was run by Shane Glines. He did the character designs for Batman, Spumco, and all that kind of stuff. He was awesome. He was amazing.
Yeah.
But he used to run this message board called The Drawing Board, and it just blew up with like a lot of indie artists and artists who post their works. There'd be like forums, like drawing forums, and people would just post their stuff and get feedback and all that kind of stuff. But most all artists helping artists. No matter what level, there was no like
Haters?
yeah, no haters. It was they're all like professionals and yeah, but there was no like
There wasn't any. There were a few trolls. There were a few trolls, but
but not many. And they usually got
but they got
squashed
taken care of. Yeah. Yeah.
And then he used to post, and I used to post,
yeah.
but we knew each other's artwork before we actually. And I was living in California at the time, so
Yeah,
And then
I remember like most of the same people that we knew, much like Bill.
Yeah.
Well, Doc. I'm sorry, I should say, but we had that mutual friend, and he used to post on there too. So I knew Bill from there, and also like guys like Alberto Ruiz.
Roberto, yeah.
And so I remember going to the way station. It was so funny the way things came together, because I being a big fan of Doctor Who, I went to the way station and I was just like, oh, cool, yeah, this is a bar with a TARDIS, this is awesome and everything else. And then I see my friend Bill, who before then I hadn't seen for probably 4 or 5 years. And he was like, yeah, he's doing the burlesque thing and everything else. And we started catching up. And then I met Ed. So after a couple of drinks and like us hanging out a couple of times or whatever, and then we started talking about all the
back in the day, things we used to do, and the drawing board came up.
Yeah, and the drawing board came up, and he was like, "Who are you on there?" He was like, "Monkey King," and I was like, "Who are you?" I was like, "Olokun 360," and he was like, "Oh shoot, I remember you." And then it was, because that was the funny thing about boards back in those days. Because if you ever had a meetup when you had like people that was on the forum, like you wouldn't know them by their real name, and be like, "Hey, you're like Trojan number 56 guy."
Yep.
Like it wasn't, you didn't know like.
But I was going to send you at Comic-Con. Like, we had guys from Drawing Board. We had a thing called Sketchbook Sessions. We had a booth, and I had to scribble out my freaking avatar name, my like whatever they call it. Yeah, so people would know who I was. Because there was nobody ever posted a picture of themselves ever.
That culture still somewhat persists on Reddit. In fact, kind of like the holdout of the old message board system.
Well, YouTube as well. I mean,
not YouTube.
No.
I wouldn't contend that.
There's a lot of the persona. He just hit 8 million. Markiplier. Everyone knows his name's Mark, but like as a persona, everybody calls him Markiplier. That's his dude.
By his channel
But
name,
by
you know.
nature, YouTube is a
Yeah.
much flightier system. You know, it doesn't have the same like tight ingrained communities. You know, that will sort of
and
return
it's-
to over time.
And it's and some
That's-
of these
it's
forums
whippy.
have persisted 15 plus years. I know I've still got usernames for forums that don't exist anymore.
And
And
so
get
where,
the emails too.
so where did the idea to cross over both comics come from, other than both of you guys being friends?
That's well, we it just seemed natural. I mean,
seemed- yeah,
because he does his takes place in the bar, and mine takes place at a bar, and
Right.
we're friends. I mean, and he goes to the way station, and mine's in the way station. I've been to his bar, and
So it was literally just like,
I think it
let's
wasn't-
support.
Yeah, I don't think it was like the crossover was inevitable. I think the thing that we had to come together to do was to figure out how it was going to happen, like,
Right.
what the plot was going to be.
And how you maintained like separate identities, which I think we already outlined in the beginning, and then they're both individually strong in their own right. So,
Right.
so what about those crossovers that you have done?
I mean, I want to do more.
Yeah.
I mean, we had to talk about when Yamaya, when I fell in love with her. Did you see that strip?
Yeah,
Where,
there's a second one.
second crossover where.
No, I haven't, but a listener may have.
So
talk
and then
about it
I
at will.
sort of fall in love with this
Yeah, with Yamaya, who's
Yeah.
who's the female bouncer.
So she,
Yeah.
the bouncer drags her to the way station. I fall in love with her, and then she goes home, and I'm all sad.
Yeah.
And then that's where he picks up the next thing, and then he's
Right.
like tries to cheer me up, and let me go to White Castle.
Pretty much, Yamaya is like she's sitting there. She's like, "Look, I gotta go."
Yeah.
And then the character, the bouncer, is like, "Why? What's going on?" He's like, "Yo, your man in there is getting on my nerves. I know he's a cool dude, but you know."
I remember I think the closing line was, getting shot in the face by Cupid.
Yeah.
that was it. Yeah.
Okay, I remember
it.
It's like getting shot in the face by Cupid. No.
Exactly. I remember that, and it was funny because like his character comes out in mine and says, "Where is she? What? My body is ready, and I'm ready to bear her children." Like, dude, it's not gonna happen, man. And she's just like, he's like, "Oh."
And
That
it
brought the White
actually
Castle
worked out well because she just started dating what's his name?
Seymour.
Seymour in his
Yeah.
strip.
Yeah.
So and it just kind of worked out well. You know?
Right,
At the
right.
end of the day, it must feel good to have like a fictional universe you created out of a real universe
Right.
that already you're having like cross canon trips with.
Well,
It's gotta be pride.
A cool thing I've noticed also as a regular of the Way Station is that a lot of the regulars for Fermented Zen at least wear it as a badge of honor. Like if we're drawn into the strip, it becomes a profile picture on Facebook for forever and ever. And Chuck's Facebook photo on Facebook hasn't been himself in ages. It's been a different variation of the bouncer, either from Ed's strip or from his own strip. And
But I
so
also
it's
like the
fun.
fact that I'm like one of the few people that actually use a Chuck picture,
Right,
a
yeah,
picture
right.
of me.
Yeah.
You know, on my.
That's the
my
thing.
Facebook.
I was actually pretty excited to see his version of it because, like, you know, when you draw your own stuff, you know, you're just used to your own stuff. Like, oh, I did that. That looks kind of cool. It's my profile picture. But when someone you actually respect and you like their work does like a rendition of that character, you're like, oh no, that's it for me right there. I'm posting that one. You know. But,
I mean, when I would just like when you. Because we would send each other, even on the iPhone, we'd be like, we take a picture of the screen, we just
Right.
hey, what do you think? You know, and it's like, oh my god, LOL. It's like,
and that was the thing. I think the best thing that he captured in the first crossover in Fermented Zen was like the process of us getting to the bar and then getting drunk and going to White Castle, because that was in real life, that's our tradition. And usually it's a bit of a tag team because there are nights where I can get completely wasted. And he drank just as much as I did, but for some reason he's got-
I'm more sober than he is.
and then it's like, okay, we gotta like get out of here and make sure you get home okay. And then it's vice versa. Like I'm completely fine and he is annihilated. And like I'm giving him the dad like text me when you get home. Text me when you get
That's
home.
hilarious. When you get a text me when you get home from a Chuck, that's
And he's like
Well, I think that first of all, just as far as inspiration is concerned, I mean, the fact that you work together, the fact that you pull from a lot of sources, it also helps the fact that the Way Station is a music venue and through which a lot of musicians filter down. But of course, you're also here to talk about things that have other things that have inspired you, and chief among them on this podcast, what we talk about is music. You're both big music fans, and you both did agree to an album that you brought today. And we're going to wrap this around back at the end of the podcast, so stick around for a discussion in which we do talk about music's influence on cartoons itself. So stick around for that after the review for what you brought, and tell us a little something about what you brought.
All right.
Do you want to start?
No,
Sorry. All right. So we brought John Carpenter's Lost Themes. We both love music, but we don't really have the same taste in music. So it was actually kind of hard to find something that we both like. I mean, he listens to obviously Tool.
Yeah,
he's wearing a Tool T-shirt.
Yeah,
Chuck is wearing a Tool T-shirt.
Enough.
I like Kate Bush.
Wow.
So
couldn't have gone in
I mean, the
more
last
opposite direction.
real album I actually physically bought, virtually bought, was it's gonna sound really weird and stupid. Marina and the Diamonds.
Oh, I like Marina and the Diamonds. Fruit, you bought the new album Fruit. Yeah, it's actually a really good record.
I mean, I know I look like
See,
we listen to the same stuff, but we don't.
See, that's the difference right there. I have no idea who that is, and I don't think I would have ever
Oh, I'm on the same page as you. Yeah, no, I have no idea.
But
not
no. But we both love John Carpenter, and we both love his soundtracks, and that's why it was and it just worked out that it was it came out last year, end of last year.
It came early this year. It's a 2015 album,
yeah.
I absolutely flipped when I heard that you were bringing John Carpenter's own album, because it's strange. I mean, John Carpenter, the director, the guy that everyone knows for that whole horror noir style. You think of Halloween, you think of Escape from New York, and my favorite among his work, The Thing, it has to be mentioned, which interestingly, of course, did not have his own soundtrack. And I was very disappointed when I finally found that out, because it's like, if that's what he can do as a composer, as a director, that's just phenomenal.
But it was him doing John Carpenter in a John Carpenter movie.
Yeah, it was Ennio Morricone doing John Carpenter. And I think even in one track, he did collaborate. So John Carpenter helped. He probably had some ideas. And I think, frankly, after you have Escape from New York and after you have Halloween, you probably have a pretty good idea to know about how to compose for a John Carpenter film. But in either case, it still always kind of shocks some people, whenever they first hear that he's also a composer, simply because of our fascination with the Renaissance artist, director, writer, composer, triple threat. I remember actually hearing in passing that he had done the music to Escape from New York and Halloween and was very impressed. And then it suddenly starts to make a lot of sense, because there's a fluidity, I think, of vision that I feel between his work and his music. They feel joined at the hip, and despite the fact that many of his films really didn't achieve much or any semblance of box office success, there's still a self-awareness that everything he set out to achieve, he did achieve. So whether people really dig his aesthetic or not, well, that's on them. But I get the feeling that at the end of the day, a John Carpenter film and his music are still just tight, and he was satisfied with each. Because that's what you get when you fill a aesthetic out from the same person. That's not common in movies, because movies are normally the product of so many people working together at one time, that you get what you get, and sometimes it's a masterpiece, and sometimes it's a sordid array of danger. So out of that, I've always been a fan, I think, of his work. I absolutely love that whole early demonic synthesizer era. Limited instrumentation, very slow to progress, heavy, on the nose, fearsomeness, yet nonetheless compelling in its ability to foreshadow and make you sort of writhe in your seat, knowing, or rather never knowing, that anything's going to strike. I think modern composers could stand to learn a lot, and could stand to learn some patience, I think, from this man who wasn't really a forerunning or freelance composer by any stretch, but he had the means, he had the will, and in most cases didn't really defer to anyone. Gotta respect.
Yeah.
And now here, 2015, he decided to just release an album
right.
out of nowhere, and it's called Lost Themes, so you
right.
get the idea that of course it's
right.
married to his work as a director, but it's still a chance. And I read this up straight out, he admitted he's doing it because it's a chance to have some fun with music, whereas previously he's kind of limited
right.
to a film that he directs. He writes really only what he needs to, and then it's bound to be sort of spliced up and put in its proper places. But, with an album, you can just go off on the same theme. It's not going to end. You don't have to transition as you would like a scene cut. It's more fluid. And so, let's see how he did.
So, what I like about the title, though, is John Carpenter's Lost Themes hints that these are things that he's always had, like, inside him or with him.
Right.
And they're just lost to time, and now he's finally releasing them. Sort of like an artist who releases an unreleased album. And you get a sense of that from the first track. I mean, it distinctly sounds like John Carpenter. Like,
Well, first off, it's called Vortex.
Yeah, the first
All
track.
of these tracks are just a word. It's a single word, and he's already
But they're
setting
not
up
just
visualization.
single words, they're power words, like vortex.
Right,
It's like, it's...
Obsidian.
Yeah. So, and I mean, it starts with this kind of ambient intro, but then kind of goes right away into this kind of Blade Runner-esque noir-sounding techno... Not techno, but like tech-influenced kind of sound.
Techno noir. That's the kind of the realm I've always kind of classified it. And Blade Runner is right up that sort of alley, but it's just got that kind of early '80s feel to it. The sort of idea when science fiction was becoming more mainstream as a form of the high level of movies that we were getting. So it's already harkening back to that. It's also doing something that you find in a lot of Carpenter's pieces, which is the piano statement stuff, the single keystroke piano work.
In the same, because of course he's a synthesizer guy. I mean, that's one other early observation that I think all of us made is it sounds as if he never updated his equipment in 30 years. He's still using the old Moogs and whatever, something like
Moogs are great.
Someone like Vangelis might use, his kind of his caliber equipment. But we all agreed we're thrown into familiar territory, and it's all set up at first. Very creeping intro, trademark horror techniques such as the screeching sounds like a violin being sort of bowed below the bridge or way up by the neck. Those kind of things that just like throw you off and leave you on edge. And then suddenly he starts bringing in thematic material. That steady sweep comes to a close very abruptly, and now it's just those pure piano chords that John mentioned, doubled with the synth, and what sounds like something that could be a recurring figuration. Like this could perhaps persist for the remainder of the track. But its rhythm is so sparse and a little bit cagey. It's in 4/4, but the accents are very irregular and at times sounding like this sort of broad hemiola. But instead, it's just a lot simpler. It's really just an emphasis on the one, the two, and then we come around to the next measure, just an emphasis on the three there, and then the following measure, an emphasis on the one and the three, and then an emphasis just on the one. When you hear this without the in-between accents, without, like, the tick of a metronome, it's very just off-putting. You don't know where the beat is. It's just these chords creeping up out of nowhere, and they just step forth, to kind of set you on edge. And yet, this is not necessarily the figuration. What really is the figuration is the section that follows this, which is more of a secondary exposition, a more staccato, deeper register synth steps in here, very rich with echo, panning from one ear to the other, and then out of that we get a very bizarre element, a rock guitar. Comments?
There's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with rock.
I guess he has a band called the Coupe de Villes. And I don't know if I'm not sure if he's just a failed rock band person, because he actually has a literal song in Big Trouble in Little China called Big Trouble in Little China. And it's like, Big Trouble in Little China. I mean, it's horrendous, right?
The last thing you'd expect.
But it's lots of like the same guitar chords. It's like, he just loves it.
And I had never known that until you told us today that he was in a rock band, and I was kind of like, oh, that's so strange. It's such a contrast with the rest of his work in such a way. But it also goes to show that, he's a guy, just like he had his goals, he had his other dreams that maybe didn't quite pan out. In this case, did, but that's not what people remember him for.
Right.
And he's still going to try to filter that in on an as-needed and partially harrowing basis.
Well, in this case, the guitar does a good job of complementing that configuration, which came off as like subtly dangerous, very subtle because of how sparse it was. When it does take a backseat and you go into the more fleshed out melody section, that guitar does a good job of almost harkening back to it thematically, not necessarily chord by chord, but the theme remains there. The character is not lost from the track, so it works very well.
Yeah, no. As far as the motifs that it returns to, I think it was married with the whole in terms of composition. It's really just that sort of that aesthetic divide. I think that is it's what kind of like kept jarring me throughout the album, beginning with this track. And admittedly, I think it started off as a little bit campy. I thought that in passing.
Well, that was the whole thing. I think with Vortex, The very first one, I said it was like nothing but a deleted scene where like it's from Big Trouble in Little China, but he stumbles into the universe where Prince of Darkness takes place, and it's like because it starts off like something that should be in Big Trouble in Little China, but then
with the guitar part that's really prominent in Big Trouble in Little China too.
Right.
So it's like, but he uses almost like a sound effects during musical cues in the movie. Yeah. So. But that's why it reminded me of that too. And
I guess what I'm trying to say is I took this from a whole different perspective. In my fanboy mind, what I did was I said Jack Burton leaves in the events of the last part in Big Trouble in Little China, and goes off into adventure into all of the John Carpenter universe, where he goes through every single movie. And I felt like this was the soundtrack for it.
But see, that's the very nature of what you're getting with an experience with a John Carpenter album is because it's just common knowledge that he's a director and you know the caliber of movies that he does. You're going to end up writing your own movie over the course of the album. And considering we are 5 people, we came up with some very, very divergent imaginations. But I don't want to be too harsh with this, because to be fair, I don't think that this is really the primary focus of this first track. The guitar is there, and he usually uses this. This changes somewhere later on the album, but he usually uses the guitar as more of an aside of anything. Yes, it does use the similar motifs, but aesthetically it's a departure, and then he returns back to the meat. And for this, the thematic meat is really that next set of figuration, which is this synth sound that's very pervasive, and then over that we get our first melody, which is born out of the piano. It's essentially this synth structure as your figuration, and then the earlier piano, you find that was really foreshadowing this melody, which is now present. There's lots of other bits of color that he throws in here, like sweeping chimes in the background, which of course is just synth, but it's chimes. It's how he's going to diversify here.
Well, because considering if you look up this album on Wikipedia, there are no instruments listed. It's just the tech they use.
Just the tech they use, right.
So yeah, pretty much it's all synth. It's variants of synth to sound like other things.
We have this tendency over the course of these podcasts to I think I coined the term synthstrumental at some point. That would be so redundant as a descriptor for this album.
Because it's all
instrumental. Essentially his MO. But chordally, I gotta mention, it's fairly simplistic. It's mostly just a lot of E minor, some A here and there. He goes to the 4, he jumps back. But we do start getting little transitions here, or hints that he has these sectional divides, which make me think that, he's kind of following in the vein of what he would do as a director and change his scene. In this case, you get a transition in the middle of this track where all of a sudden we start descending down the bass, down to D, then down to B, then down to G, and it seemed a little early almost for this kind of wraparound. It's the kind of way you might wrap up a battle scene or something like that. But it's almost as if we hadn't really been set up enough to pursue this kind of tactic. It's so early to sort of start going back to that. But then again, when you think of a lot of his movies, a lot of it is just one battle scene after the other, or one another task they have to complete before people are safe. And it seems like that's sort of the way he goes about his writing, which in context it makes a little bit of sense, because he kind of switches us up as a composer by going into different sections as opposed to just wrapping them up. He strangely divides up each and every section, and then instead of wrapping them up as he would do in a movie, instead he wraps up, then says, "Surprise! Here's a new thing," because I'm a composer now.
Well, I think also we have to remember that this album is going to feel a little different structurally than other things we've reviewed. Because as you said, he's a director. So he's going to build some kind of a narrative here. I think, but likely more on the micro scale than the macro scale. I think this is going to end up feeling more episodic.
Right.
Just because of the structure of each song. For example, the second track, Obsidian, is a much longer track. It's double the length of almost every other track on the record, clocking in at 8.5 minutes.
And it has the most sections.
Yeah.
To finish off the first track, essentially, that's really more of a ternary structure. It's like an ABA. He moves us into a B section. The B section kind of wraps up, and then he's he throws us back to the A section, and we wrap around. It's very straightforward, frankly, if you just subtract that little jarring section. But for Obsidian, it's one thing after the other, after the other, after the other. It really is just immersed in scene structure.
I think it's designed to be more of a standalone piece, but within it has these fractures for whatever reason. I mean, there doesn't seem to be clear-cut logic why he goes from A to B to C. It could be just because he doesn't know a good transition for it, so he just jumps from part to part.
That said, each of the parts have their own redeeming factors. Everything is still, like, really solid. You start with some crystal chimes, some high synth, you get some darker stuff, and then you start getting some really interesting layering. And this is the first section I'm really being attached to. Very unusual layering composition of just a huge variety of synth layers. All different tones, all different cadences associated with them. Over just very solid, simple drums.
The chime work steps back in. It's kind of just like arpeggiating and gurgling in the high end. Meanwhile, you have this booming, droning bass line. And I remember you mentioned that's how you defined his entire work also.
Creepy doom bass.
Creepy doom bass was the words you used. Very apt for this album, too.
It's funny because, like, I definitely hear what you guys are saying. For me, I'm coming from more of the creative standpoint of, like, his narrative.
Right.
And it felt like in each track, even with Obsidian, it felt like everything that was going on was to him telling a story throughout the whole thing. And this is the reason why I think this particular album, or even some of the tracks, if you're a fan, you'll understand. If you're like one of those people who like just wants to try something new, you may not if you've never heard of his stuff or if you don't know. And I think like one of my more favorite movies that he's done, like it's arguably like my favorite, but it's Prince of Darkness. Prince of Darkness, the reason why I liked it wasn't because of the story, it wasn't because, it made sense or whatever. It was the overall feeling that he set throughout the whole thing, this feeling of doom. And in the soundtrack, he kept it going. And it was a little bit different from most of the other movies that he was doing because it was like a feeling of dread that no matter what you did, nothing was going to work out of this situation. Big Trouble in Little China, you had something in there. Thing, at least, there was a chance for McGreedy and Keith David's character.
Thing there was barely a chance, though. You're in Antarctica.
There was still a slim.
There was still like a slim little, but it was a badass outcome because like you got these two dudes that can't trust each other and they're sharing a bottle of whiskey and you're like, okay, yeah, all right, we're gonna see what happens. But like in Prince of Darkness, you had this thing going, and this is the reason why in Obsidian, I felt like it was more of like the escape theme to something, but leading up to the battle of something else.
That's an interesting interpretation, which I can entertain. Honestly, my experience with Obsidian, I think Obsidian is one of the more fascinating tracks on this entire album because it's 8 minutes long and because it has so many different sections. I had lots of different experiences through multiple listens. On a first listen, I was like, okay, that was an interesting turn. That was an interesting turn, and then on a re-listen, sometimes the things kind of start binding together, and you see what he references here and there. And then at the end of the day, like you said, you were looking at the artistic or the creative standpoint. Sometimes it just comes down to aesthetic. If you're into the aesthetic, then you're going to accept most of these changes because it's just showing you different sides of who John Carpenter is. Just to walk through some of these sections here, I noticed this really started kicking up after this like chime work that we get in the beginning. All of a sudden after that we're in double time and more of that arena rock guitar comes back, which I still thought was campy, but we don't stay there.
Arena. It's like
That's
metal.
how I'd describe it.
It's metal light. The lightest side of metal you could possibly find. The sort of thing that you would have seen in some
I would describe that as arena.
Okay, maybe. But it was instantly, just for me, iconic, really bad barbarian cartoon metal. Like, really bad stuff. The sort of thing where he's riding a dragon forever in the song itself. There's no scene changes.
So like Man of War, kind of.
Yeah, like Man
the
of War.
lowest level of cartooning you could possibly get, where it's just glitchy as all hell.
Well,
That's that music. That's that guitar.
whatever you may feel on that section, I feel like
I don't think it's that bad.
No. I think it's not a bad thing musically. I just think the cartoon's just that's a whole different discussion.
Yeah, I didn't have too many associations with it, just outside of it being kind of arena rock to my ears. But I could also tell that I feel like that's not really the theme here either. I feel like his experimentation as a composer really comes through here in the transitions. And because, we described it before, there's a lot of places on this album where the transitions are very harsh, in which case you don't really have a transition, you just go from one section to the other.
Right.
But we do have little transitions here. They do start to step forward in Obsidian. For instance, there was this, really, like, the layering was absolutely fantastic at a certain point here, only like 2 minutes in. This, like, gurgling bass steps forth, like some kind of, like, demonic beast lurking below, which was a little bit industrial at that point, which is not a word I would think to necessarily apply to him, but really it makes sense, I guess, if you kind of combine two different elements. It just, industrial came after it, but who knows? Maybe industrial music was inspired by John Carpenter. Who knows? That would be an interesting twist. But, so I'd argue he's of the ilk. But the synth here, it's much more playful. He's playing with, like, the implied eeriness of harmonic minor. That's what he keeps going back to as a composer. That's where I saw the composer shine through. Because it's true that composing, I think, is a more complex talent than mere setup, which is what we had gotten in track 1. At some point, you have to break from sectional divides and explore. And then from there, we pivot back and forth. We go back to the arena rock thing. Then we have another transition. And then it starts playing us around with more descending bass lines. This one a little bit, I thought, less crafty than the early one. And this is why I'm having, like, the back and forth experience with this track. Like, first listen, I'm thinking, like, that was rough. Right. I love the feel of it, but that was rough. You know, just considering I have, like, composing background, I'm seeing it through these eyes. So I am, you know, but then you listen to it like the 4th or 5th time, you're just like, screw it, it's awesome. Yeah. You know,
I feel like that's going to come up a lot with this.
You're not on our level. Yeah. That's the score.
I think that the intricacies, the more you listen to it, the intricacies either become more apparent, less apparent, or blend. I mean, for example, those transitions didn't seem as prominent the first listen, but as you pay more attention, you can kind of see how the structure of the song is built. I just like the fluidity of, like, the middle part, like that bass you were talking about, kind of gives it this almost liquid feel, like as if you
it's sort of like it has, like, these independent swells. It steps forth, and it's like I described it as a gurgling, you know, and it is like this underlying force throughout the entire piece, or especially throughout that, like, B section specifically.
And you get some parts that we start talking. Really start harkening back not just to the movies of the era where he got his start, where this music would have been perfect, but also video games. We start making a lot of references to video games. One part was like straight out of Castlevania, 2 maybe, real 8-bit, and then the guitar comes in, so it's like the remastered version of that same thing.
Alucard, like
Symphony of the Night, because that was all more orchestrated versions of what the 8-bit were.
Exactly. It was specifically more along the lines of like a villain reveal or something like that. Like you're starting to get characters being introduced. And
that's what it felt like.
It's all association, though.
We were talking about this earlier. It's like when he writes his movies and he scores it, it's almost like an extra character in the movie. It's like it's a John Carpenter movie, and so-and-so's in it, so-and-so's in it, and his music in it, because it's like that's like it's just a staple of a John Carpenter movie, and it's like this is almost like hanging out with that one person kind of thing.
Yeah,
and I experienced that new character that he steps for that he brings for out here in the C section. The C section of this piece. It's almost like it retracts a little bit. It's not as brash, and it's not as much of like a going into battle as it had been. I think in the earlier portions, all of a sudden it recesses, and now it's like longing. I initially described it as like howling to the moon or something like that. It's a fairly brief section, but it's really, really sweet. And it's again, the movie is filling out. It doesn't matter who that character is. It doesn't matter where he is. He could be in space. He could be in the nether world.
The music
who knows?
itself in a John Carpenter movie is like that extra character that's not there. But it's like you know he's there because it's a John Carpenter, because it's his music, and it's like when I hear the album and in these songs, it just harkens me back to when I was like, because I have the soundtracks and watch the movies, and it's like, I guess I'm just more acceptive of these weird changes in the music, because I'm so used to listening to a John Carpenter album. I guess.
You know because you listen to them independently.
Movies.
Well, let's look at another change here that I was more supportive of. In what I can only call maybe the D section of this piece, there was a very interesting proggy thing that he did. It's probably the only like progressive rock element on this album, where he goes into like this, what I could heard as a 9/4 time signature, or at least pivoting back and forth of like 4 and 5 or something. It's fairly bizarre, but the kick drum I notice is what really drives it here and gave it this force, but it doesn't feel as, I mean, yes, it is outlandish. All right, let's get that out of the way. Yes, it's outlandish, but it's a joy, to experience.
And for me, it worked.
Yeah.
I thought it was pretty awesome. And I think that's coming from, like, I guess from a creative standpoint of, like, even when I do, like, what I do as far as artwork, I sit there and I create little soundtracks depending on the feel. Like I'll sit there and I'll say, okay, like I'll have like a whole soundtrack to like I'll take elements from like the Lord of the Rings soundtrack, even from like John Carpenter and everything else, and I'll put them all out in iTunes and I go by it and everything. So I'm kind of used to having those kind of changes because it just depends on the mood. So if I get to a piece I'm doing in the comic where it's a little bit more angry or happier, that track will come into play and it works with it. So I'm thinking when he's actually writing the script or doing the actual directing, he's thinking about these tracks in his head and in those transitions during that moment. So he's like, all right, this character's coming in, he's going to do this and that and the third, and I want this to sound like that. Even though if it's an abrupt, change or whatever.
It's all about the drama. I mean, that is coming across. It's just, in this case, and throughout the album as a whole, it can come off as a little bit too dramatic when you start really shifting from one sound to another without any sort of additional element. You have to really start trying to focus on instruments, on the characters the instruments are building. At least in my eyes, and at least especially for Obsidian. Once you do that, once you hear the guitar as one person, when you hear those higher chimes as another person, you can understand how the scenes are changing from one to the next. But without that, it becomes a little bit jarring.
Well, there's 2 points I want to make on what both of you said. Starting, first of all, I think with the titles, he sort of enables you to kind of keep it a little bit broad. I mean, Obsidian. Yeah. What is that? All right, what is he setting up here? So your story, your movie in your head can be as broad as possible. Hence, all of these different emotions, as you said, you're working through playlists, working through soundtracks, they can strike you in accordingly, depending upon, well, all right, we're going from a jaunty section into a longing section, into a more jaunty section. All of a sudden it's I don't know, I can see this happening, but in a vaguer sense, and that's really what the state of music is. But the second point I was going to make is, of course, the fact that he is more of a visual guy, and the translation of that to a solely musical project, I think enables it to be, maybe it's possible for it to be too broad, I think. Because I did find myself starting to long, I think, for some on-screen action, like where I could detect this is a director. With a composer, it's supposed to be a little bit vague, and the composers always expect that you can fill in the gaps. But this is one where I could feel like it was written in, like the visuals were there in advance.
Right.
But now you're just getting one filter, as opposed to an artist who, and of course, as a director combo composer, he could put it all there in a movie, but now here it's kind of like he just sliced himself in half a little bit. That's one experience I had.
I feel like, though, in the next track, Fallen, track 3, you get a stronger narrative. Like I said from the minute it started, first of all, the title itself, Fallen, a fallen hero, and the song starts, the kind of ambiance that's built is this kind of urban darkness, think Batman or Spawn, with a fallen hero, either the parents are dead or they're coming from hell, this kind of dark past. And it really is conveyed in the early parts of this song.
It starts off on definitely a down key because the percussion is very muted. It's almost like an underwatering
It sounds
effect.
wooden almost.
It's not just wooden, but it's like a soft wood. It's like there's a pillow in the way from the sound actually hitting you. Between that and the frankly whiny tones of synth that he's thrown right into it, it's I called it San Fran Tokyo. It's what Japan would have done if they had made the neo future, the noir future.
You see the issue with perspective on this album.
Yeah, but to use my metaphor, it's dark but full of neon. There's a lot going on there because that muted nature definitely makes those shadows deeper that he goes into as this song goes along. But those higher percussions, that's that flashing black bright lights. That's that neon just breaking through once in a nut riot.
Right.
It's the combination of the two that right away, like Matt said, setting is huge. It's already here. There's already more detail, even though it's starting very simple.
Well, at some point, away from the things that you can describe very just candidly as the sounds that you're hearing, some of the only ways to describe these tracks are by describing it through your own perception and the own story that you build in your head. So, for instance, you mentioned you heard something, a wooden sound, Matt. I immediately heard that as that steady thump that returns almost every measure or so. It sounded like a marimba, like played in like a reverb hall with a little bit of an echo there. Just it taps and then you hear it just again later a little bit weaker. I thought that was a lovely touch, considering most of these things sound very, very electronic. He adds that one little acoustic element. That's beautiful. But then as far as like the feel of this track and the perception that I gather, this to me was more of a classic horror approach. This to me was like a retro 1930s Dracula almost, just in the chord progressions themselves. Again, that's where I sort of get most of the feeling here. I noticed he started off in F minor, and then he makes this transition to B diminished, then to E flat minor, and then to B flat 7, and this this is like a classic wraparound to modulate down a whole step. That's so classic in a way. Like I know, just to describe it, by the key changes, it sounds a little bit foreign, but it's the kind of thing that it cuts through in so many different places that it's bound to bring you back to that point, because, of course, 30s horror, it's classic. It set the tone for all horror that followed. Right. So, it's interesting that he would want to go back in that direction. But at the same time, I also kind of see why wouldn't he be influenced by 1930s horror? He's removed from it, but maybe it's an homage of sorts. So,
I mean, he was a huge old school horror movie fan to begin with. I mean, his favorite movie growing up was The Thing from another world. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's even in Halloween, his first movie. They're watching The Thing. Right. So I mean, he's just loved the genre. So I can see you being like, when you said, "Oh, it's like the 30s," like I could totally see him be like,
got it.
I don't know if it's accurate, but I mean, it sounds like it totally could be. Like it
could be. It's what I heard.
Like him being, using that like homage to the 30s horror. Like I'm sure it's probably in his head somewhere. I mean, that's crazy.
We had a discussion, interesting, because you mentioned The Thing. It's why people have to refer to it as John Carpenter's The Thing. It's because, well, there was an older one.
Exactly.
People have forgotten about it because John Carpenter's just this massive force that now that's what you think about when you think of
that version of The Thing stood out, especially at the time, above anything else. It had nothing like it, and as far as special effects in that movie,
it was tough.
There
was not. It was absolutely nothing like it. Nightmare-inducing for anyone who watched it.
Yeah.
Like, I watched that movie, and I was never really big on horror movies, except for the cheesy ones like the early Jason, Freddy movies, because those looked so ridiculous.
Right.
I could survive those, but I happened to channel flip past that, and the scene where, like, the neck comes apart and the creature... I couldn't. Like, I didn't sleep, I think, for 3 days straight. It was just, don't turn off the light, it's gonna get me.
Yeah.
And I get a sense of that in this song too, like that kind of horror. It's why I mentioned Spawn specifically of all superheroes, because he was, he was a hellspawn. He was a hero quotes, hero.
But Fan Tokyo.
But he was from hell, and he was sort of a good guy, and like he has such a dark, horrific, and horror-filled past.
He's sort of like Batman as summoned by the devil.
Yeah,
and I get that, but I didn't see as much horror. I think that's what it really boiled down to for me. In this song, this felt more like a really classic pseudo-ly thriller science fiction.
Well, even
something along the lines of like the original Total Recall. Like, it's dark, there's some messed up things going on there, but it's definitely, for me, just with the electronica that's involved, it's just the connotation. I'm feeling more science fiction going on.
Well, even in this track, you're dealing with 3 different sections. I mean, what I'm describing is just the first section. Right. And then all of a sudden, it's hard to really stick with that as I go into section B, section C. At that point, I had another connotation, and it's a connotation that comes back, I think, for a lot of electronica of the era. And I mention a lot of this podcast, and every time I mention it, I always have to say I mention it a lot in this podcast. So, really getting tired of it.
No.
Vangelis. A lot of people know him as the composer for 1492 Conquest of Paradise or the Blade Runner soundtrack. He was the go-to guy. He was a Greek composer, and he dominated the electronic era. And I could almost see John Carpenter borrowing a little bit of what he might do as a composer who was a composer first and foremost, and then was sort of hired for filmography. And then John Carpenter here has his sort of reversed vision, it seems, even if they may have grown simultaneously. So it seems like he was bringing that back in the B section and the C section, and that whininess that John described in the very beginning is really what I heard later, using these like synths to just sort of like screech and squeal over the remainder of the track, and overlap each other as they go. That seems to be a common thread he goes back to. But yet it also had a really, really rallying build-up. Toward the end, it seemed like almost this was like that of a fight scene or something, like you were building to something.
Right. I think that was what I got from it. It felt like in the beginning of the track, it was like this hero that kind of like failed.
Yeah.
Like we had a plan, people died, and it's my fault, and we got to get the fuck out of Dodge and go. Like that was the whole thing, and
that would be married to those like modulations that he does.
Right. And then when you get to that build up, it's kind of like, okay, we have the realization of what we really need to do now, so let's go and get this thing going. I mean, that's exactly how I went through every track in this album. Like, this is a movie, and each one is a different part to a movie.
And that matches up perfectly. I mean, it's sometimes you have to insert or at least invest a little bit of confidence in the work being done. Otherwise, you're not listening to music right.
Well, also, especially with instrumentals, sometimes processing is easier when you build a narrative around it, even if it's not necessarily there. Right. And we're going to, I think, keep doing that in every song. I mean, from the moment track 4, Domain, starts, you get this kind of more of that creepy horror feel, but it also feels like the lair, like it's called Domain. It's like the villain's domain, his home, his lair. These songs aren't these titles aren't an accident. I'm sure he's creating these scenes a bit in his head as he's constructing them.
It's a location, but it's also a destination. It's not just to my ears, it wasn't just a close-up of the Dragon's Lair or something of that sort. It was also that Mount Doom off in the distance. Right. It was still something that had yet to be attained, that you haven't yet faced the big bad evil guy. Mm-hmm. It was movement. There was still movement in this part of the track, which was an unusual way to describe a location, is to have that promotion of movement, that promotion of sort of time elapsing.
I think rather than movement, what I would like to pivot back to here is another case of building a character. What I got just from the beginning here was that the piano has a tendency to step away from the rest of the music, as if it were its own soul, so to speak. I got like Phantom of the Opera, or even like something like Beethoven might do, when like in the middle of a concerto, he would just go off and do something. It's like this downward progression, as if he were just in octaves, nothing terribly complicated, but it's as if like the music just sort of had to halt to let the piano have its soliloquy. That's not something else he really does in the rest of this album. Then all of a sudden here, it's very, very strong. Then I have one little issue.
Oh.
I think we know what it is.
What was that?
The B section?
Oh, the B section.
The B section.
The guitar stepping back with that. I feel like I'm being trolled at this point.
Okay. I love that section if it was in a completely different song. And the reason for that is I was already seeing a very, not quite science fiction, but a very fantasy-oriented location. Yeah. I was seeing a dark place. There's clouds or everything like that. And it's all of a sudden, it's like the General Lee shows up. And those boys are in trouble again.
Yeah, there you go.
And they're on their way.
Mount Doom.
They have the ring, and it's time to go to Mount Doom.
Exactly.
And Boss Hog is falling. I mean, come on. It's such a disconnect.
I'd watch that movie.
Yeah, it's strong.
I would actually.
It's,
that would be pretty funny.
Oh God, what was that Jack Black video game?
Oh, Brutal Legend.
It was like that. It was like,
I love that game. That was my game. I love that game.
But it's like that first scene where you're going from a guy playing a guitar, and then all of a sudden he's in the metal world. But it's that harsh of a shift.
But to me, I like that shift. Like, just throw me in there.
But for metal, that works. For here, this ain't metal.
This is true, but I think...
Well, I was going to say that Chuck pointed out earlier when we were listening that it was kind of as if it was shifting perspectives. Thinking if you're directing a movie and you're focused on the villain and he's explaining his evil plan to his hostage, and then it jump cuts quick to the hero who's on his way to get in there.
Yeah, in that sense, I was thinking
of
Flash Gordon, pretty much. Right. Flash Gordon would have those... You're in Ming's palace, and there's evil a-doing, so you have to have a theme that accompanies that, and all of a sudden you're in the clouds with the Hawkmen, and you're just soaring through. And that's what the guitar does, essentially. Because then all of a sudden we come out of that, and we have further sections of the track.
That third part, it almost harkens back to that Castlevania theme we were describing earlier. Starts off almost tribal in that beat work, but very quickly just reintegrates it. It's much more expansive than that original theme back in track 2, Obsidian, and I feel like it's just harkening back to it. There's more movement involved now. There's more speed involved now. It's a callback to the story he's building, but it's still different enough to be its own scene work.
It kind of feels like what you just described, like, you know, you're on the Hawkman rocket cycle, but this time the little bad guys are like hanging off of it. Like, that's what the speed up was. Now I got to fight stuff.
That's right. I remember you mentioned that earlier. It was like the henchmen. You know, the henchmen are getting killed. You know, and you have that in this new figuration that steps forth through in the 16th notes. Like, I mean, how much? That's like the only thing you can use. In fact, it's really to fulfill that point.
Right. Well, yeah, the idea of, in the old movies, the endless waves of henchmen, like they'd show a camera angle from one side, the hero fighting, and just got onto camera,
Not one of them even nicks.
No, and then he just knocks them to the side.
They're all impotent.
That's Stormtrooper effect, but that's a whole nother tangent.
It's hero physics, man. When you're the hero, you don't get touched, man.
It depends on what you're a hero in. If you're a hero in the Joss Whedon universe, you're in trouble.
Oh, yeah,
you're probably dead.
Especially if you're not the main hero, just a hero.
We seem to come out of this track pretty much knowing, like, we have our set visions, and we go into a track called Mystery.
So this one starts it goes back to the darker side, which we get hints of throughout a lot of the tracks, but here we start with this kind of looming kind of feel, and it's the first track where we actually get like a real drum sound, like a rock and roll drum kind of sound. It's not a synthesizer. It doesn't sound like a synthesizer making a drum beat. It sounds like actual skin. It sounds like a drum beat.
That was more toward the middle of the track. The interesting thing about the beginning is that I found this was a much daintier track. We hadn't yet gotten there.
Yeah.
Instead, it was really just a lot of this like arpeggiation upward, and I gotta say it, I gotta make one little point here. He has a fascination with the flat sixth as an interval. Just using like seesawing back and forth on that, he just crisscrossing back between that and the tritone. I don't know. It's a musical thing. Everyone, as a musician, as a composer, everyone has their thing that they go back to, and it maybe defines your sound. I'm going to say this does actually define his sound, because it's not something I often think of defining any other composer's sound. So, in this case, alright, he kind of owns it. And especially with this arpeggiation and the chime work, it's just this very dainty and, yes, true to form, true to name, mysterious track. The bass itself was also kind of developing, but slower, and it was reacting. This is the first time I found that it was reacting to the melody in the high register, as opposed to simply banking on the fact that it was just a bass line, and it should just stick with its motif and just remain constant for the remainder of the track. Instead, here, it was comping, it was fluid. This is what I want to see from John Carpenter, the composer.
This slow, this very expansive idea, it's fun, but at the same time, this fun is on a grander scale. It approaches epic.
Yeah, especially when it builds from that daintiness into the round drum set. You know,
that's where it really does, and it's twisted. It's askew at the same time. It's not just a regular a view of this music. There's something going on here that does separate it from the more natural feeling that you come to expect from this very classic style of guitar work. It means that this track is sort of a reveal track. It does a good job of that. It's a build up to, well, okay, if Domain was describing a bad guy and, well, the boys were showing up to beat up the bad guy, something didn't go quite right, because when they get there, they beat up all the mooks, they beat up all the ads, and now they're going through this castle, this mountain, this volcano layer, whatever, and this song is doing a good job of really creating a mystique for that idea. Because there's no hero here. This is the mystique of the previous location.
I think I see what you're saying there. I think it's reflected in the tools that he uses. This is a track that I think develops more in layers, if not in content. In other words, you don't really get new content. Instead, it's just new elements. For instance, we're using the same exact motifs, the same musical melodic segments and then they're just applied to different instruments at different times. Same with figuration; they're applied in different forms. At first, they're not really present, but then they step forth in the drums, and it's just like there's not really new content here. We don't really get scene changes. Instead, this track really is the first case that I noticed in this album of true fluidity throughout, and him just playing with one layer after the other after the other. That's what I want to see.
It really kind of makes you take a different perspective on what we've been getting so far. This is very different from the previous tracks we've had.
It was the one that started cementing the idea of, oh, these aren't just songs that he or pieces he came up with.
Right.
They never made the cut into a movie. It started actually feeling like he was building a story with music. Mm-hmm. It was this track that really started cementing it, because it's an odd place to have a track that kind of breaks the mold from all the other stuff he was doing. Mm-hmm. But to have that elongated scene is pretty classic when it comes to horror-oriented pieces or thriller-oriented pieces. And it's kind of in the same sort of spot that you'd expect it in the movie itself.
About halfway through the narrative.
Halfway through, and all of a sudden we're going to see the guy that's got to get beat up.
I enjoy the fact that it ends abruptly. You know, if you're going to take that as just a single piece, you know, that I think is a success both as a compositional piece and something that could be applied to a film, then I think it's perfect to just end it abruptly. And don't necessarily wind it down, but just end it as if the entire piece, the entire track, I can for the first time describe that as a solid scene as opposed to a collection of scenes within.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think the only problem with that is then we go from track 5 to track 6, and Abyss, while John was saying that track 5 felt very original for the album, track 6 is the first time I'm going, oh, Abyss, that's from... What movie was it? Movie, because it sounds...
Well,
this is the closest one that sounds exactly...
This might be a contentious track for us, because we had a lot of disagreements even when we listened to this as a group, you know, about our experience with this.
It felt like a side-scroller at first.
I felt like I'd heard it before. I felt like this reminded me of something he's actually done before.
You know what? It might have been part of a remake of the Altered Beast soundtrack, of another one of those light metal introductions.
Yeah.
It's weird this way.
At one point, I mean, it was so brash, and this time it didn't seem like an aside with the guitar, that I thought, what was this, Trans-Siberian Orchestra? I mean,
hey, I like them.
I know, but would it belong in this album?
TSO, no way.
Not necessarily. I mean, I don't know. My issues, I guess, again, come down to more compositional techniques. I feel at this point, he just kind of phoned it in the beginning. Mm-hmm. To me, it's still exciting. I want to reiterate that. It's a very exciting track. But in terms of what he uses, it's still just like this kind of boring C minor pattern. It's just essentially just crawling up C minor. 1, 2, flat, 3, 4, 5. You know, 1, 2, flat, 3, 4, 5. And meanwhile, the bass is descending down minor, 1, 7, flat, 1 flat 7, 1 flat 6, 5, and that's it. And it seems like he's not really playing around with that. They're not reacting to each other here. It's contrary to the exact compliment I just gave him. It's unfortunate that at this time he seemed to phone it in a little bit, but I don't know, because aesthetically it's still rousing, but it's just I'm forced to kind of grapple with the fact that when you are working with this thin instrumentation, then the thing you have to succeed in is ambiance. Mm-hmm. And if, Matt, you said you weren't able to necessarily pinpoint this as being anything like specific, or maybe rather the Anywheresville rousing track, the Anywheresville fantasy track, you know, then all of a sudden you're just one of the pack. That's not what I want to see out of him.
I felt like there were fantastical elements, but I feel like I can see what Chuck is saying, that it did kind of have that side-scroller kind of feel, like old school video game kind of feel.
Altered Beast.
But the problem was, it still felt familiar enough, but I couldn't get a clear picture of the narrative. Right. But every other track before this, I felt something specific. We may not have all felt the same specific narrative, but we all clearly pictured something.
We all got a really cool movie going.
Here it was a little more clouded, I felt.
Right. I think Ed got it when he was like, it felt like you were falling,
like spiraling. Like when it was going repeating and repetitive. I thought I gave me like sort of like, as it seems, just spiraling into or out of the abyss, kind of like.
And that's where it makes that transition where the song starts to get deep and it starts to get like,
halfway through, it started. Honestly, this was the first instance where I was actually really, really glad that someone dropped the bass. It's strange. This is probably, it ended up being one of the more unique rousing tracks halfway through this very track. I know it's kind of ironic, and maybe it even doesn't really match up with the name you might think of, Abyss, but to be honest, it worked. It really worked. It's this like steady thump that it sounds a lot crisper, I think, than anything he'd previously used. Most of his stuff is very kind of like muffled and gurgled. It's creeping. It's not in your face. It's from the depths. But then all of a sudden here, we're ready. I don't know what for, but we're ready.
Something's coming out.
It seems to kind of go back to your interpretation that all of these tracks, even no matter how depressing they may begin, toward the end, it's like I know what I have to do.
Exactly.
And it was a lot deeper. It was a lot more eminent. And honestly, that cycle or that spiraling, it had the same rousing quality that I could actually apply to a specific Vangelis track, and that was Alpha, which, well, because I know it only through its vinyl record, is the first track on side B. I didn't mention the album, which is Albedo 0.39.
Which you've mentioned 7 times.
So many times, like, it's not even funny.
Wait, you listen to Vangelis, not a movie soundtrack?
Yeah.
Oh, it's not a movie soundtrack. Yeah, this is like a
Was he at the Acropolis? I mean, it was...
Nah, it's before that, 1977. I would recommend it. So from there we go into track 7, Wraith, which I would like to describe in the broad first, just so we can like get your guys' opinions on the individual sections here. The very, very beginning here, I noticed one initial thing. It's disconnected from the whole, and that's the guitar, for the first time, I think, seems to be its own melody here. It's not just that, like, departure where it's done normally, where it's like, all right, we're going to have this little guitar scene thing. Instead, this actually comprises the entire section here, and I think that was, it felt like the meat. It felt like the meat as opposed to the departure. And then from there, we go into a second section, which, again, was the parts that I'm looking for in a John Carpenter album, and the parts we hadn't really gotten yet. And I would describe it as like a sound art section. It was like defined by these little ticks and pops and bloops and underwater sound effects that were like reacting against each other. It was absolutely gorgeous. And it sounded like something that maybe I couldn't even quite pinpoint as a John Carpenter thing. It almost sounded like him being experimental for himself. But yet I would still love to see that implemented in a John Carpenter movie, just because I'm a fan of his work. I'd love to see how he'd do that. But then toward the end, he kind of refers back to the beginning here with a third section, something he doesn't really have to do in the movies, which of course is transitions. It seems to me like they're not really necessary in the movies because they get cut and spliced and as scenes would dictate. But toward the end of here, we go straight into a guitar solo. And that's a reference to the early section. It's just a straight-up guitar solo almost for the remainder. It doesn't seem totally improvisatory, but it seems very, very defining. And I love that contrast between, like, the guitar here, which for the first time I'm on board with, because it seemed like it was less of an aside, but more the character. And between that and these, like, you know, underwater, just this, a more reduced section. Again, I love his contrast with brash and recessed.
Well, I think that the thing about this song emotionally is I made Chuck laugh. I said at the beginning, it had kind of a tragic hero feel, like almost in the early Spider-Man movies, the early X-Men movies. All of these Marvel movies had these terrible CG kind of swipes with CG webbing or CG DNA and the names swiping by.
Before the MCU became a thing, it was you know, Tobey Maguire
and Ben Affleck.
Yeah, I know. It's the
Daredevil. And so it kind of had that kind of montagey feel of like setting up this tragic backstory. Someone lost their parents like, or their eyesight.
I think I named it the Destiny of Darkness.
The Destiny of Darkness.
It was like, okay, this is going on. And then this was actually the first track that didn't necessarily feel like it belonged in the John Carpenter film.
Yeah.
It was like a departure.
And I think that in every track, I was trying to mend all of his universes together. But this is the first one I actually listened to. I was like, I would really want to see where he went with this. And I could actually appreciate it to be just an instrumental track by itself without having to be connected to anything. But
well, it shifts. These are these major shifts going on from section to section, but it doesn't get lost. And that's one thing that really did stand out as far as this whole album goes. It's so through line, all said and done, that it was kind of weird because you're right, it was a very interesting piece and a more concise piece, a more connected piece, But honestly, at this point, for my previous like dramatic scene wipes and everything like that was in the earlier parts of the track, I'm used to it now. I'm ready for them now.
Right.
I'm ready to go from, Mount Doom to the twist, the General Lee showing up. That's okay at this point. It's okay.
Like I'm going from Hoth to Endor. Like
It was a big difference. You're going from a desert to a forest.
Yeah.
There's no like nice overlay. There's no like little plot points in between. You were just going from one scene to the next. That was working. Here, it works on a different level, but not on the album scale, and that was my main complaint going on here. The other thing I did really like was a lot of the violin-oriented synths that were being overlaid throughout parts of the song. That was very intriguing by itself.
There was a focus of strings more in this track, or finger quotes strings, because it's all electronic, but it sounded more like strings, more natural almost.
It's definitely something we can overlook, and that perhaps we have to overlook, is that because we're so busy talking about, sections and, like the bass line of the melody, the two most obvious things, is like there's lots of little pieces of color that he throws in here. Despite just generally describing his work as thin instrumentation, there's lots of things that creep up on you, and then after a while you notice, like, oh, that's kind of cool. Oh, wait, that's been there for the last 2 minutes. How come I just noticed it?
It's when the transitions shift and the song itself shifts, some stuff comes more to the forefront as the song is transitioning.
There was also the lack of the piano, I think, was another telling feature here. Without that statement piano that he likes to use so heavily.
It seems like it was supplanted by the guitar.
Or even those pops, those really poppy synth noises as well, was sort of like they were both doing the job of the piano, which was a character that is very missing from here.
It seemed like that, I think that was really more the thing that was replaced. I agree with that. All right, so let's move on to track 8, Purgatory. This is another one. First of all, I have to make a direct correlation between the title, Purgatory, and the earlier title we had in track 6, Abyss. Only because you think Abyss, and I kind of think of Purgatory. Like, I think the nature of Purgatory is being in an abyss, being in a state where you essentially have no control, you have no life, you have nothing, but you're waiting to live, waiting to die, waiting to be saved, waiting not, That's the concept behind it. And so I feel they're very, very intertwined. But I was very kind of iffy on the beginning of Abyss. In fact, it was one of my main gripes, is the fact that I didn't really feel like I was in an abyss. I had innumerable, issues with his musical approach, to say nothing, the fact that I didn't really feel like I was put in any setting, maybe that's the abyss. No, I'm not gonna. That's cheap. That's a cheap shot. I'm gonna ignore the fact I said that. But in the case of Purgatory, I felt like it was a success. It was a little darker, as it should be. It's bleak. It's Purgatory. The descending bass here also was captured by a different instrument, or what sounds like a different instrument. It's probably still synth, but it sounded more like an upright bass in this case. So you captured a whole different, a timbre, a different approach to your gurgling bass line.
It also, the piano's back, and this piano says sad. Lowercase sad. And I was explaining this off air when we were listening. When you see an author writing in his story and you see him actually put a capital for a commonly used word, you know that word has a lot of major meaning. It has something big going on. On the flip side, when there's just a word by itself or the beginning of a sentence and that word is not capitalized, it does a whole different thing. It de-emphasizes it, or in a lot of ways emphasizes it negatively. Not negative as in it's poorly done, but negatively as in it's even worse than what it might in fact mean. This was that lowercase sad. He knows his piano. That much is obvious. And here, it's so punctuated, it's so specific as he's pressing it, it can't say anything but that word over and over again.
What I like about this track is that it's the first one that really conveys an emotion just through the sound by itself without setting building. Like, besides the fact that you feel like you're in purgatory, you feel very listless listening to this track, and it's conveying that kind of lack of control, that listlessness, just in the structure, the piano bits, how it sounds. But then when we make a transition, I think Chuck might have best described the narrative of this track when we get to a more action-packed part of the song.
Right.
You had said it was...
Ving Rhames?
Yeah, it was like... Cause no, it's what it was. I was like... At first it felt like, in agreement with you, it was like weightless sadness.
What we were talking about, what was it?
But towards the end of the track, it was like... okay, fine. The main character is in the weightless sadness. Now we have the opportunity to go get him. So it's like the cool black dude in the movie, because the beat picked up like it was on some like funk, and I was like, oh, okay, cool. This was going on right now. It was upbeat, sounded like an R&B track, and I was like, okay, so the black dude, which is his boy, like probably like some Ving Rhames looking character, and he was like, I know how to go get him. Let's go get him right now. We're gonna make the plan, and everybody's like, what are we gonna do? So it was like, we're gonna go save this guy from purgatory.
And all I could think is I would watch that movie with Ving Rhames saving some helpless white dude stuck in the purgatory.
And it was actually well done. I mean, first of all, you said in the wake of sadness. What happens here is in that like transition, what we get is it boils down to just like these gaseous sounds. You just hear like wisps for like just a couple seconds, and then all of a sudden we go full force into that section B with like these rolling drums, much more march-like. Heavy with the accents, sounding more like a real drum set, as you said. And you know what? That movie works for me. It works, especially considering the transition was well done in this instance. So yeah, it seems like he always does want to like end his tracks that way with a kind of like, well, let's fix this.
Let's fix this, exactly.
All right, so from there we go to track 9, Night.
Ooh, yeah.
We have another cyber noir kind of exposition right into this. Here, unlike a lot of the other tracks that were doing layering, this build is very, very slow. It seems to take the entirety of the track to really hit the culmination. Though there's no crescendo, but it takes forever.
It's much
in the song to do all the things it's gonna do.
Definitely, I think it's much steadier. It's more dire. I think it's defined by that sort of muffled, like metallic bass in this case. Which used to be colored, but all of a sudden now I found that the bass steps out of its role and starts dominating as the melody. But in a higher register, it actually has a very strange echo, at least in how it's executed in this track. It has this strange, like, echoing, just like taps against itself, which I thought was really, really cool, especially since it was given the spotlight, and then it recesses and the melody trades off and returns to a higher register instrument, and I thought that was another really, really classy thing to do as a composer. So, yeah, this is almost like the expected track. I feel like a John Carpenter movie really couldn't end happy. It's actually kind of ironic that we just described every track as ending as if there's a chance and that we're gonna fix things, but really at the end of the album, it's more dire and more depressing than ever.
Yeah.
It's called Night.
That's
it. That's the end.
Well, that is actually quite John Carpenter. Actually, there was Starman. I don't know if you guys ever seen Starman.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, sure.
And he goes, yeah, that's not really how I would end the movie. If I had to redo it, it would probably just like reach into her chest and grab her heart and just kill her at the end. I mean, that's because you never end in a good note in a John Carpenter movie.
No,
It's
never.
Like, that's just that. So it's a kind of like standard Carpenter that it's kind of like, oh man.
Oh, man.
Well, I remember you saying this was actually your favorite track.
Right.
Thing
It is
in
my
the beginning.
favorite. It's the most Carpenter.
That's what that was.
It's very reminiscent of like basic Carpenter, and because John Carpenter hasn't really done a good movie in 20 years, it's nice to hear like new music, and it's actually just pure Carpenter, and I just enjoy it, and it's not something I've heard from the last 20 years.
I think also you agreed with me that it kind of bookends the album because both the first and the last track were very strong.
Yes.
They have similar sounds, similar themes, and it kind of wraps up the story, which essentially ends on a very dark note because Carpenter movies very rarely end on a good note.
And a darker note than how it started off.
Yeah.
If it harkens back to Vortex, it's still not nearly as fun as Vortex
and it
might have
ends
been.
abruptly, and just like
it just kind of fades like really quickly.
right,
Yeah.
and it's like that last note. It's like that's a very Carpenter.
Oh yeah.
And then we're going to get the final credit roll, and there's not going to be any noise.
Right.
Nope.
There you go.
Just silence as you sit
Maybe
looking
like
at the
a-
credits.
Maybe
like waiting background
Exactly.
or something.
maybe you think there's going to be a chance, kind of like the end of the thing, but not really.
Yeah,
I always assumed that what I took from it at the end of the thing was that one of them is going to kill the other.
Yeah.
I was nearly positive about that.
Right.
Well, but
How can one be? But I was pretty positive.
or maybe they kill each other.
Yeah. Oh, they're both the thing.
I think the thing would know the thing.
It's
Maybe
true,
they're
because-
different things.
That's right. It would be the things then.
They were rivals the whole time.
It would be thing 1 and thing 2, technically, if you counted them.
A Seussian Carpenter mashup?
That would be terrifying.
Whoa.
That would be.
That's what nightmares are made of.
That would be informative and terrifying. Both going on right there.
On that note, we go into our wrap-up.
Why don't you get us started, Steve?
The way this works for our guests, we just have a brief little monologue describing how we feel with the album, and it's on a 1 to 5 scale. All right. Getting us started, as I'm being asked to. I believe that John Carpenter is definitely an underrated composer. I believe he should be doing more of this. I kind of wish he had been doing more of this, because I believe if he had been doing more of this independently, as opposed to just for his soundtracks, we would have gotten maybe a more finished product here, and I wouldn't have had all the little gripes that I had. I think just from a composer standpoint, he's still living in that director's mindset. In the course of thematic material, in the course of aesthetic, that aids this album, because it makes it very, very on the nose, and you're able to build your own story. Well, that makes things... that puts things in their right place and then builds the narrative for the listener. But, and this is something that I think is going to come up in our discussion after we finish, is that I think that some things are meant to be a little bit vaguer. I don't believe that the merit of a good work of a good musical work is how many visuals you can apply to it, but how many feelings you can evoke over the course of it. And I felt like in that it was a little bit weaker. I detected his old tricks, and they were great for nostalgia purposes, but I enjoyed best those moments where he stood out and he did something a little bit different, and when his skills as a composer shine through in those transitions. And they were few and far between. Still, I believe this is a great solo project, and perhaps the start of what I hope is more solo projects from him. I hope that if, as you said, we haven't gotten a good John Carpenter film in many years, well, you know what? This is a pretty good retirement project. I mean,
totally,
it fulfills you in a way, and I'll still be following every release. So I'm really glad you brought this. To me, this is an average album. Even for a composer, I believe it's an average album with some perks in it, and most of those perks are its ability to put you in that world and at least enchant you along the way. I think this is a 3.25, that is.
Okay, for me, I feel like, I have a mixed relationship with John Carpenter. Like, I love his work, but his work also terrifies me a lot of the time. Like I said, The Thing was something that gave me nightmares for a long time. I wasn't able to watch it again until I was an adult. Like, an adult, like a few years ago, adult. Because I knew, I was pretty sure if I turned off the light, The Thing wasn't going to get me. But I still wasn't 100% sure. Yeah. I think that structurally, anything that lets my mind wander a bit, I really like. And not wander like I'm bored, but wander like create. As a avid gamer, D&D player, anything that I used to draw, I used to, and I creatively work within a music space, obviously. I really liked being able to, on a lot of the tracks, let my mind go to different places. I just found, like Chuck was saying, I was just continuing the John Carpenter timeline. I wasn't really creating my own narratives. Right. I was building narratives with either within a John Carpenter universe or a Castlevania universe or very established universes. I think that speaks to what Steve's saying from a different angle. There wasn't enough originality for me to go, oh, this is something new. I don't know what to call this. Like, I kept equating it to stuff I've heard before because it had elements of those things. But that said, it was a lot of fun. I like it. I would definitely listen to it again, and I kind of now want to create some kind of narrative for it. Like, I want there to be a movie for this.
I know.
It's like Play-Doh. Here, make what of it what you will.
Legos. Come on, 21st century. Man.
And so for me, I'm going to rate it a little higher than Steve just because it let my imagination run wild, and that kind of giddy joy I always love getting. Like, my favorite thing is when I get into a new D&D campaign, I have my character and I'm just told the base narrative and go, okay, create. Why are you in this world? And then my mind runs wild. And this album really let me do that. So I think it's closer. It's not at a 4 because, again, he's still, like we said,
evoking feelings is the more I think, important thing.
Yeah. But he hasn't made a good movie in 20 years or so. And he sounds like he's playing on equipment from 20 years ago. And it's a style that hasn't really grown a ton since 20 years ago. So I think that still staying so far in the past like that, instead of working to your advantage all of the new things that are around you, hurts it just because he could probably do so much more if he featured a producer who maybe is used to more experimentation or partnered with somebody who did. So for me, it's a 3.75 because that emotional creativity it added to me brought me closer to a 4. Since I rate more emotionally, it really brought me there.
2 other albums we did which were in the same sort of ballpark as far as abstract storytelling we're getting here were The Migration, Scale the Summit, and Tomorrow's Harvest, Boards of Canada. Well, ones that we did back in the first year we were doing this podcast. 2 albums I really just love. In those cases, exactly what Steve and Matt said in many ways. They were more evocative emotionally and more interesting in my mind's eye. But in those cases, I also found some very clear, defined roles for those songs, the same way I found them here. My big hiccup is really, honestly, there's something that I began to forgive and expect towards the end, which was those dramatic scene changes. That was the one thing that truly held back each piece from being solid for 6-7 minutes, as many of them were. That kind of like skipping nature, the dramatic scene wipe, is something that works on a visual scale because you're automatically, oh, look, there's Han standing right there. New scene, new story. We're picking up from a different storyline. Here, while instruments remain the same throughout, like that piano that I love throughout, the identity of those instruments is not strong enough to create their own individual roles. I wasn't, oh, here's the guitar, now we're getting character beat. It wasn't that strong. It was more on a song-by-song basis. But that said, there were still all those great parts, and it was really just an enjoyable piece in the long haul. For that, I'm kind of split between these two, and I'm going with a 3.5.
3.5. All right. You both get 2 monologues, and you both get 2 ratings, although they will be averaged together in advance of the total average. I've done the math. It works in the album's favor.
Oh, so we don't have to, like, pad it?
No.
Yeah, well, I have 1 column in our Excel spreadsheet for guests, so
Okay,
that's
all right,
why.
right. No, I mean, I'm just, like, I guess I have, like, 7 soundtracks of John Carpenter on my phone right now. I mean, and they just put me in a mood when I'm like, feeling a certain way. I'll put them on like I'm walking down, like Prince of Darkness. If it's starting to rain, I'll put Prince of Darkness on. If it's it's getting a little like sun, I'll put the Fog on, or Big Trouble in Little China if I'm like feeling like an energy mode. So after so many years of listening to the same albums over and over and over again, here's a new John Carpenter thing, and I don't even have to relate it to any kind of movie. It's its own animal. And I mean, for that alone, it was just fantastic for me. I'm not saying for everybody. And I just love it because it sets the mood for me. I know you don't get emotionally invested. It's not an album you sit around your house and you put it on and be like, I'm going to sit around and listen to this John Carpenter album. Like a lot of other albums, but there's just something about it, and it might be the fanboy in me that I just love him so much.
There's a fanboy in all of us,
and it's just like, oh, it's so awesome because it brings, it's like a little nostalgic feel, actually a giant nostalgic feel, and of like, oh, this is just so great. And I mean, you guys are naming like Castlevania and like Monster something, I don't know. I don't play video games, so like all these things you were talking about, I have no idea what you're relating them to. So for me, it's like, oh, I guess so. Yeah, I don't know. I can't do it. It doesn't sound like anything I ever heard before because I don't play video games. So
well, I'll interject to say it does bring me back to a style of horror, an aesthetic of horror, which I felt was more riveting than horror as of late. I think it was actually the last great hurrah of horror. Right. So it has that going for it.
So I mean, I would give it a 4. I was gonna give it a 4.5, but then I had the DJ remixes on the last part of the album, and it's like you don't really need that. So I'm taking points off just for that.
Right. So 4 it is. Okay, Chuck.
All right. I mean, well, first off, just listening to the album, I listened to it last week, and I fell asleep listening to it, and I hadn't heard, Prince of Darkness in so long, and I woke up to most scariest thing with because he actually has audio from the movie, and if you remember the movie, there's like that whole thing was like, please do not adjust your whatever transmitter. And I'm waking up to that because I was listening to it on Spotify.
Oh, you were playing the whole discography
and then it
on
was like the whole
Spotify.
thing, and I was like, oh my god. And any soundtrack of any kind from this dude that can still bring that doom into my heart when I wake up, he did his job. So with this, I think he went to a certain place. I told Ed when I first got here, when we first met up, I said, it sounds like deleted scenes without the actual visual to them. That's how I saw each track. I was like, I can tell what movie this one was, and that's why in all the notes I did, I kind of like compared the two movies. Like, this is where Jack Burton meets the dude from Prince of Darkness, and this is where the Prince of Darkness dude meets the guy from The Fog.
That one, it sounded like Escape from New York. So it's like, but it's actually after Escape from New York, but before Escape from LA. He's making his way across the country.
It was one of those things. So, and as someone who is a creator, I draw and I like to fit the mood for everything, and I make soundtracks when I work. I felt that it was. He did the same thing that I do when I create a story. I make soundtracks for my stories in like iTunes. I make like little playlists. Except he's actually going to compose them. So that's the whole
Another
thing.
level.
I say I'm going to give this the remixes. I didn't mind too much. I really didn't listen to them as much, so I don't.
We rarely count them anyway, so
Yeah, I'm not gonna fault him for that. I mean, they were fans.
Well, I just think it's like, we got to pad the album. I mean, you got like 9-minute songs. I mean, do you really need to pad the album?
He didn't need to.
And it was only on the deluxe version. The version we reviewed was the original version with only the 9 tracks.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and give him a 4.2, and the only reason why I'm giving him a 4.2 is I don't necessarily know if these are lost tracks that came out a long time ago that he's putting together, he remastered or whatever, or if it's something that he created now. I feel that even if he did create it now, I do give him the credit to capture that same feeling. Even though he could have worked with newer instruments and he could have worked with newer stuff, newer tech, whatever, but to have, you're talking about 20 years later and you're still making me feel like I was when I was like 12.
working within the constraints of his memory.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and I'm
our
just
memory.
like, that meant a lot to me. So I go ahead and give him a 4.2.
Okay.
On this one, yeah.
You bumped me up. I'm a 3.5. I'm with John.
Okay, all right. We come around sometimes.
That's right.
I want to take some time at the end of the show to just talk a little about something that actually you guys both mentioned when I first mentioned the idea of bringing you on. I'd actually first talked to Ed about it first. And Ed's like, oh yeah, but you should bring Chuck too. Let's do like a double up animation hour.
Right,
and I was like, yeah, that's a great idea. But me and Ed a lot talked about, because they had an exhibit here recently, which I unfortunately didn't get to see, but there were Chuck Jones and the cartoon work that he did and the composition that he had in his songs with, not his songs, but he would use such interesting music in those old cartoons. Meanwhile, cartoons today, like the Teen Titans cartoon had a song custom made for it by a J-pop band. You know, all of the stuff composed for the DC cartoons is all brand new works, either from Warner Brothers or somewhere else, from Tim Burton or whoever else, Danny Elfman. The interesting thing about those old cartoons is they would either repurpose classical music that existed or create new music that ripped off or just sounded like old or parodied old music. And I just think it's really interesting that newer cartoons don't really do that as much. Not that I've noticed, anyway.
If I could boil this down to a kind of thesis, I think the contention would be that that cartoons of that era, of a certain era, were originally filters, I think, for a lot of culture, a lot of existing culture out there.
Right.
And lately it seems to be more of just a
form of entertainment.
a form of entertainment with a kind of like splatter, like a canvas. You know, like it's what it needs to be, and scratch the earth to find something that fits.
Well, I mean, a lot of the Looney Tunes and even like the Tom and Jerry's and some Tex Avery MGMs, they used the classical music because it was known a bit. People had classical music, but it would use it for the comedic value.
Yeah,
which is because it's like, oh, that's familiar. Oh, and that's funny because it's like he's singing Figaro, but like he's like singing in like a high pitched voice because he had like the thing that what did they use the they used to drink it, and heads used to shrink. I can't remember what it was. Anyway,
Well,
so
yeah.
like it was like random things would have like Bugs Bunny would be conducting the guy singing Figaro, and he would make him do stupid stuff or whatever, right? Lithium, that was it.
Lithium,
oh,
yeah.
okay.
That's right. That's right.
And so, but then like the big, actually the wide, it was just easy. It was just parody for parody's sake. I mean, but then it would do Fantasia came out, right? And that was a major thing that Disney was going to have that as sort of like a traveling show around the country, and they were going to do it like once or twice, once every year or every other year, but take out an old segment, put in a new segment, just to bring classical music to the people, to let them hear it for the first time or whatever. And then they kind of failed miserably.
Yeah, well,
Looney Tunes started making fun of Fantasia. I mean,
Yeah.
they do a corny concerto, which they may have. They do the blue,
The Blue Danube?
the Blue Danube, and all that kind of stuff, right? And it just sort of parodied, and then just kind of went crazy.
Right. Well, also,
And,
like, if I say to anyone at this table, think of a factory scene in a Looney Tunes cartoon, you hear the song playing in your head.
Right.
You absolutely hear the song, you know, because
the
that...
Rube Goldberg song.
Yeah, that kind
Yeah,
of thing.
yeah.
At its core.
But it's
Exactly.
actually a Powerhouse by Raymond Scott, which is funny because he didn't get any credit for it. Carl Sterling got credit for it, who's the composer for the Looney Tunes.
Yeah.
And he ripped him off. A lot of that stuff. I mean,
Like-
we were talking about it earlier about like how every morning scene
Oh, yeah,
is
morning
Edward
scene.
Grieg's
They go
morning,
back to
you
Grieg.
know, yeah, and
And forget about the implementation of In the Hall of the Mountain King.
Well, and then there's some of the bigger, more interesting takes they take on these classical songs, which Ride of the Valkyries is one of my favorite cartoons of all time.
Oh,
It's
kill
one of
the you mean Kill the Wabbit.
What's
Kill the
Opera
Wabbit.
Using Ride of Valkyries.
That episode had a lot of little unique factors, and the final nail in the coffin was the fact that Bugs Bunny lost.
Yeah, it was one
It
of the
was
first
such a-
cartoons where he didn't win. It was a
was like-
tragedy.
Yeah, it was. It
an opera.
actually.
Yeah.
Exactly, and that was one of the most interesting things I think Warner Brothers has ever done in their cartoon realm. It's such a unique idea, and it's the only idea I think that nowadays is. Well, it really transcends from what the old school Looney Tunes was really doing, because you don't have a lot of the pop references in some of their music really translate to today. A lot of the classical music, well, kids aren't going to really be getting the joke, but if you know Bugs Bunny always beats Elmer Fudd, you know that the one time Elmer Fudd wins, it becomes a tragedy, not just for Bugs, but for Elmer. Stuff like that, I don't see today in cartoons.
Well, if I could just, I mean, maybe amend the earlier statement, the earlier contention. I don't know. I was just kind of spouting a contention. I don't think it's all of our contention. It was my contention. But I think it's really less that, that modern cartoons are going in the direction of just sort of taking whatever they need. It's cartoons and really any form of art are always a product of their time, and they will draw on influences of what is popular at the time. Now, of course, these cartoons that we're talking about are from the 1950s. Still, it's history for them, most of these classical pieces, but it's still, like, fresh in the cultural mindset. It's the kind of thing that you would just go to, because there's not the compendium of Creative Commons tracks that you can pull from, and classical is the go-to Creative Commons, pool, essentially. But it's even less that. It's really more the implementation of the time. Because, of course, you remember that most of these cartoons in their initial state were shorts in the beginning of films. Yeah. So, of course, if you're going to be on the cinema, then what better place to bring forth, like, grand statements like an opera aria or like an old classical piece than something that is a little bit more broad by nature, as opposed to something... Like, cartoons are so plentiful now that, in general, a lot of it is regurgitory. Well, if they're episodic, then they just have soundtracks, and they just hire a guy, and he does what he needs to, and maybe he'll pull from soundtracks as necessary. But all of a sudden, if you have an audience and you know that your audience is going to be of a cinema caliber, and they're paying good money not just to see your cartoon but to see the feature that follows, then it seems to me that you might intentionally choose something grander, on a grander scale.
Well, I also like that musically Looney Tunes would reflect on the times, too. Like, think of... One of my favorite Bugs Bunny cartoons is the one with the two gangsters, Muggsy and the big one. And at one point, like, I don't remember why Bugs is dressed like a girl, though Bugs was often dressed like a girl. And they put on a record player, and it's like a Charleston, and he's doing the Charleston and constantly kicking him.
Yeah.
And, like, it's reflecting on the fashion time, the musical style of the time, and then also making a joke at the same time.
I would wager that was like the banana peel of the era, because it seemed like everywhere, like some like it hot. I don't know, dressing up as girls. I don't know. And then the British had even more of a fascination with that, culminating in
Bugs'
Monty
case,
Python.
he was just being transhuman. Like he was
That's
just being,
it.
that's what it
That's
was.
what it was.
He was fooling everybody by identifying himself as human. That's what
But I think also like a residual effect that happens from the classical music being in Looney Tunes, especially when I was growing up. Looney Tunes were on all the time. Tom
Yeah.
Jerry was on all
Constantly.
the time.
Yeah.
So it was like it made me actually interested in finding out more about classical music.
Yeah.
Which I don't think kids I sound so old. Kids I am old. Kids today are like not having that sort of like exposure, even if it's a little bit, even if it's a cartoon. You know, like I just went to go see Bugs at the Met. They did a whole music Bugs Bunny with the New York Philharmonic was playing along while they were showing the movies. Playing live music, the classical music for these pieces. And the conductor was like, he says when they're like practicing, the Ride of Valkyries a little bit, and he goes, I see you people out there saying kill the wabbit, and he thinks it was great, this is a conductor of a New York Philharmonic, thinks it's fantastic that like people got into classical music through Looney Tunes.
So this really does go back to the earlier contention in that case, that it's like, it does seem like you feel that we've lost something. We've lost that set avenue, I think, because of course now things have changed. Well, it's not as if that stuff has just disappeared. It's shifted. Now you have to go on YouTube to find it, or you have to have Boom Network, which I think is the only one that I found that really shows the old cartoons. I get it on Time Warner. It's up in the hundreds. It's really not in prime spotlight material, but I think that's a flaw, because the YouTube generation, while it's great for anybody to get something if they're interested, I feel there's less of an avenue today for the everyman, the every child, to just get something without by choice. Because think about it, most kids do not follow things they need to at least know what's out there before they can follow it, before they can make that choice.
Well, the thing is, I remember watching even Tom and Jerry, the whole Is You or Is You Ain't
Yeah.
That was like my first exposure to like jazz and like big band stuff and everything else. But I mean, I'll fast forward even to something in the 80s. And even two of the cartoons that influenced me greatly was heavy metal,
Of course, sure.
and then it was rock and roll. Now, watching these two things as kids, that they used all the bands that were around at the time, all the rock bands and the metal bands and everything, and even in rock and roll, they went as far as to using like Earth, Wind and Fire, Blondie, Cheap Trick. I had no idea who these people were.
and original songs for
the movie
feature,
and that's the thing that was amazing about it. So I think now the problem that with cartoons now is that there's a cartoon for every way to basically advertise for something. So it doesn't the whole aspect of it being an art form in order to expose you to something new, or you wanting to say, hey, like I can make a joke about this pre-existing song along with this cartoon and people will get it and everything else. I think now a lot of people don't necessarily trust their audience anymore. They basically treat them like they're stupid. They're like, okay, well,
It's been more about selling a product than anything else. I mean,
well, based on your earlier point, it seems like you're going back to the antithesis now, which is, of course, that, well, maybe it's really less... It seems really more, I think, to what you described, that where it is just the product of the times. If you can get other bands and other artists, such as jazz, I didn't even think of that. Actually, jazz was about, we give it less credit for this, but jazz was just about as prevalent in 1950s and 60s cartoons as classical music was, because jazz was the thing of the era, and jazz was the most popular art form in America from the 20s through to the 60s. So, why wouldn't they pull from that? And that kind of contrasts. It doesn't say that they had a classical bent or that a cultural bent. That's a perfect cultural bent, but it's like that's something opposing. It shows that splits were starting to begin. It's just the trend was that you do classical prior to that. I don't know. It was just maybe it's all just trends in the end, and now we're just in an area where we can be more diversified, and we just think it's broad.
Well, there's also a pretty clear division nowadays between children's cartoons and adult cartoons. I mean,
that's true.
now something like one of my favorites floating around is Adventure Time, and it's billed as a children's cartoon, but there's so many adult-themed jokes. Not saying like dirty jokes or anything like that, but the sort of stuff you only are really going to get if you have the experience and the processing for it. So instead of having music being a major aspect of it for anything from just exposure to social commentary, for the ones that are made for 16 and older, you're talking it's more just having a discussion about something. When you start looking at like the subtleties that are involved with something like Family Guy, or Family Guy when it was really good, or Simpsons when it was really, really good, there's a different sort of discussion going on than what the old Warner Brothers, Hanna-Barbera, and all that sort of stuff was doing.
But see, in bringing up those things, you move farther and farther away from cartoon. At that point, cartoon is just the medium. At that, you're really pursuing more of a sitcom than anything else.
Yeah.
Or if not a sitcom, then a dramedy, whatever. And that, I noticed many of those cartoons, they don't even have soundtracks at all. Or if not, they have the standard theme that was born out of the original theme.
They got like the Brady Bunch thing going on.
Yeah.
It's like when they're happy, it's like and when it's sad, it's like dun dun dun. It's the same theme, but just different tempo.
It's just there, and there's very little emphasis as far as the content is concerned.
And the last like sort of hurrahs for this whole music-centric idea was Animaniacs, was Tiny Toon Adventures. They were like the last gasp of
Tiny Toons Adventures.
That Warner Brothers.
Tiny Toons was the only cartoon I ever watched growing up. Like that was when I was of age to watch. Because I watched Looney Tunes growing up, but they didn't come out when I was growing up. They came out when you guys were growing up.
Yeah.
But Tiny Toons was my Looney Tunes because they had a whole episode that just revolved around popular music. They had Sell Out by Real Big Fish on that episode. And they did also some older 80s, 70s, like they did a bunch of great songs. They did Respect. They did these great songs, made their own music videos using the cartoon characters, but used the actual songs.
Right.
I think
as a whole.
I think the thesis is holding less water.
Yeah.
Well, there's also one of my favorite from Animaniacs, United States, Canada, Mexico, Panama.
Which is an original composition by Rob Paulson, who is the voice of Yakko, and, I'm not going to remember his name, but it's an original cartoon composer who worked with all of those Steven Spielberg cartoons. And they actually tour that music sometimes. Which is like, those shows, they made original music that was reminiscent of stuff that Looney Tunes was doing in the past. And it's just, I think it's a bummer that we're kind of without that in the cartoon world anymore.
Well, I mean, I just when it all
back.
started was like classical music, and how Looney Tunes was the sort of gateway drug to classical music. That's what my whole big thing was.
Yeah.
Not that like newer cartoons didn't have good music. It's
mostly
just,
that it doesn't have that gateway.
Yeah, it doesn't lead you in. It's like, they have their own songs. They have this. They have that. It's like the older cartoons. Like, we can find out if you like this song that they sung or they're parodying. We can find out more about this. It's like.
But then it becomes more a question of a pro-classical bias. Like, that really becomes a thing. And don't get me wrong, I have that pro-classical bias. It seems like you got it too.
We talked about jazz. I mean, Betty Boop was all those. I
just wrote an article on this year. Betty Boop was Cab Calloway. Cab Calloway was like that early 30s, like cusp of the big band and swing.
Whole freaking cartoon and him doing Minnie the
Moocher, Old Man on the Mountain, St. James Infirmary, which was used in the Snow White cartoon. I love that whole style, and it was like one of the earliest, best fusions between like Max Fleischer's artistic style and Cab Calloway's musical style, and it just married. It was essentially the precursor to the whole concept of a musician working with an artist, like the whole Burton Elfman thing, and the idea that they in tandem could form their own aesthetic that was unique, not to any one separate one, but them together. But that's actually a great point, and for them that was the aesthetic. So that's an avenue, and in that case, actually, Cab Calloway, I think he composed one of those tracks, specifically "Old Man on the Mountain," because Minnie the Moocher was already released, St. James Infirmary was already released, and they were applied. "Old Man on the Mountain," pretty sure that was written for the cartoon "Old Man on the Mountain," and it featured the whole 9 yards, from him dancing on stage and then filming it and then doing rotoscoping.
As characters.
I think what we're really saying, guys, is old cartoons are amazing.
That's right.
And they should be seen more.
They should be seen. Hey, that's a better thesis.
Warner Brothers
for sure.
was frankly amazing.
I want to thank you both again for taking the time to come on the podcast. This is a blast. Two guys that I hang out with at one of my favorite bars all the time, but are also very smart and very talented. So they're already featured on our links page. If you go to websites that we feature, both Fermented Zen and Bounce are there. Please go check them out. Go all the way back to the beginning and read them forward. It's the best way to do it. Also, Chuck has a book out, right, for Bounce?
Right now, I'm touring the con circuit. Actually, we did our last con in North Carolina this weekend, so it should be available soon for print on demand.
Great.
I'll definitely post it on the site when it's available, but you can get a digital download for it now. It's on my Facebook, so...
Excellent. Awesome. Yeah. And I hear that the day this episode comes out, as you're listening to this, there's a brand new Fermented Zen, so please go over.
Finally. And I'm mad at myself, too. It's been so long.
And, of course... Bounce prints every Monday,
Wednesday, and
Friday. Wednesday is a one-panel short, and then Monday and Friday are full 4-panel comics or more, depending. Yeah. So definitely go check that out. Before I have you guys say our wrap-up and wrap this up, Steve has some words for us. There's no bump. Next week is our 3-year anniversary. We will do our 150th episode. There'll be more on that next week. Steve?
Spam?
Oh, yeah. Are we doing spam this week?
Yeah, we're doing spam.
Okay, it is spam. Well, oh, yeah. I do want to thank Star F again. He recommended our album last week, and after listening to the episode of the album he recommended, he wrote us a thesis on why he loved it and his points on the album.
I was going to read it. We have time constraints.
So
sorry, buddy.
So maybe next week. But thank you for writing us, and Steve will respond to you because he's wordier than I am.
Yes, I am. And speaking of wordiness, he's a soulmate. So I rarely even think about this subject. In Marsabut and Samburu districts, the Samburu and Rendal regularly fight it out with the Borana over grazing land and water resources. His famed advisor was a wizard, and he himself is said to return to Britain in its time of need.
What?
From Clash of Clans Hack-Tool.
He's talking about King Arthur and the whole Camelot Avalon mythology that has sprung up.
Yeah, thanks for contributing that to my article, Less of Progressive. It'll be very valuable.
Yeah, in the early days of our website, we didn't get any fan mail, so we read spam mail. And so when we run out of fan mail, we go back to reading the spam mail.
The emoji ones are particularly enticing.
So, again, thank you guys for being on the show. It was a pleasure to have you. And will you kindly do our sign-off for us?
Sure.
Music is life, and
life is good.
If you enjoyed this and other album analyses, topics, and guests, please subscribe to the Crash Chords podcast on iTunes, where you can also rate us and review us. For more media, also subscribe to Matt's one-on-one interview series, Crash Chords Autographs. To receive emails on all new content, subscribe at the top of our homepage. Also receive updates by liking us on Facebook, following us on Twitter at Crash Chords Web, our Tumblr, and our YouTube channel. And remember, keep the discussion going, because music is life, and life is good. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to share them in the comment board below each post. Otherwise, email us directly at admin@crashchords.com.